Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And many thanks also to the Wildlife Conservation Board for sponsoring this meeting, which basically provides us with a venue to discuss projects that are focused on evaluating and addressing stream flow limitations in our local streams. As most of you know, every year, hundreds of adult coho salmon return to the Russian River watershed to spawn, and thousands of Salmonid young of the year are generally distributed across many streams throughout the lower basin in late spring and early summer. But except for perhaps in the very best of water years, maybe in 2019, for example, the majority of these fish usually won't live to complete their life cycle. In an average water year, it's not uncommon for half or more of the rearing habitat in some of our prime coho streams to be dry by late summer. Drought year conditions can be far worse, like in 2015 when less than 20% of juvenile salmonids in 5 of our highest priority coho salmon streams were rearing in habitat that remained wet all summer. That's 80%, actually a little more than 80% of our salmonid young of the year that didn't even have a chance of surviving due to stream drying. We haven't crunched the numbers yet for this past summer, but I would bet my right arm that it was equally bad or worse in that regard. Fish rescues have become totally commonplace in almost every summer, but clearly those are far from a sustainable solution. So really, any way you slice it, we cannot argue that insufficient summer stream flow is a definitive bottleneck to salmon and steelhead recovery here in the Russian and obviously across a lot of other coastal streams. Fortunately, there's an amazing group of committed, while obviously mildly insane people like us, and most of you here today who just are not going to accept this fate without a fight and have been working their butts off to evaluate and address flow impairment in order to kind of improve the odds of fish surviving the summer in our streams and hopefully completing their life cycles. One contribution to that collective body of work is this effort that we've been conducting for the past few years through the support of the Wildlife Conservation Board. So the primary objective of this meeting is to provide you all with an overview of that work which we've been doing. And this will be covered in the first half of the meeting by Troy, Elizabeth, and Hannah. Then we're going to take a brief break. And in the second half of the meeting, we'll hear from some of our partners at UC Berkeley, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the water boards who've been kind enough to join us today to offer an overview of their efforts to address stream flow and also to learn more about the fish and flow relationship here in our watershed. I'd like to emphasize that this is by no means an exhaustive list of the flow work going on in the watershed. There are a lot of additional valuable contributions that have been made or are underway by many very skillful and creative and capable groups, including O'Connor Environmental, UC Berkeley, the local resource conservation districts, Trout Unlimited, and others who've been working consistently to conduct valuable and informative studies and to develop and implement flow improvement projects. We don't have time to cover all that work today, but I'd like to acknowledge the many people who have made and continue to make substantial contributions to this greater effort. So I just want to give you a real quick summary of the WCB grant work that will be the focus of our next few presenters. In 2017, our program here at California Sea Grant was awarded 3 years of funding by WCB to conduct flow and salmon survival studies to support flow restoration in Russian River tributaries. Along with, fortunately, we were able to work with a really brilliant team of researchers from Ted Grantham and Stephanie Carlson's labs at UC Berkeley, as well as a great team of hydrologists from Trout Unlimited. And the first objective of this project was complete the final year of data collection. Okay, so one of the objectives of this project was, was to complete our final year of data collection for a salmon survival study that we've been working on for 6 years. And we had a UC Berkeley postdoc researcher who was Ross Vandervorst working with Ted and Stephanie, analyze the long-term data sets and determine which stream flow and related environmental metrics best predicted summer survival of juvenile coho salmon in our lower Russian River tributary streams. And the results were published last spring in the journal Global Change Biology. Very interesting manuscript. I highly recommend you reading the article. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to cover that today. But I will definitely mail everybody. I will email you a link to that. And also Ted, for those of you that were at last year's meeting, Ted did give a presentation that summarized the key findings. So I will send the link to that out as well. What we are going to be focusing on today from this grant is the work that our group did to conduct a sequential wet-dry mapping all through 3 consecutive summers, 2017 and 2019, on Dutchbill Creek, Green Valley Creek, and Mill Creek, and then look at those wetted habitat conditions in relation to stream flow, fish distribution, and flow augmentations in those stream systems. And we're also going to hear about the work being done by our partners at UC Berkeley, who use the wet-dry mapping data that we generated to develop a statistical model to predict the level and distribution of stream drying in those systems. And I just wanted to be clear that the intention of all this work is to help resource managers and recovery partners to better prioritize, design, and evaluate flow enhancement projects, to support effective strategies for the timing and the quantity of flow releases, to inform in-stream flow recommendations and water policy, and to support planning for emergency actions related to drought and flow impairment. So with that, Troy's going to start us off. Troy Cameron works with our program here at Sea Grant's Russian River Salmon and Steelhead Monitoring Program, and he provided a lot of invaluable assistance with field data collection and spatial data processing for this project. He's currently summarizing the outcomes for all of our wetted habitat conditions in relation to fish distribution, and he's going to cover that with us now.
Great. Well, Sarah essentially covered my entire intro for this slide. So yeah, I'm going to get stuck straight into it, talking about impacts to fish. So as she also mentioned, we are focusing on 4 core survey streams: Dutchbill, Green Valley, Mill, and Felta. Although Mill and Felta fall under the same watershed, we break them apart and lump them in depending on our goals. But we survey these streams every 2 weeks. May through October, where our final survey was generally 21st of October or so. And we were just mapping the presence or the absence of surface flow through these reaches. But why are we doing this? To evaluate the impacts of stream drying on salmonids, taking this opportunity to combine and overlay the coastal monitoring plan data that we were collecting on winter red distribution and summer juvenile distribution in hopes of helping coordinate fish rescues, also prioritize areas for stream flow enhancement opportunities and restoration projects, evaluate the timing and effectiveness of flow releases and ground truthing predictive models that are being developed, as we'll hear about later, and track changes before and after potential projects in these streams. In terms of applications and technology, most of these surveys were conducted with a tablet in hand, with GPS being boosted by a Bad Elf device. We kind of refined that to start using Trimbles, which are a lot nicer and more accurate even. And we are running this through an ArcGIS Collector Classic application and Survey 123 form for all of our other data collection along the way. And we were combining all of our maps into PDF map books and emailing those out, but in 2019 we got a little bit fancier and created this ArcGIS story map dashboard for the public to interface with. So anyone with this link could access this data, no password or anything like that. And you can tab through our streams here. Mill and Felta are combined on this tab. You could look through all of our samples by week, get an overview of the conditions by sample. Also check out any of the other additional data like stream flows available here. And we have a few widgets for our other data like dissolved oxygen, temperature, riffle crest depth, with a few options to look at averages, distributions, ranges, things like that. So really good tool for people to interface with, really intuitive. But I also want to take a second to define what I mean by intermittent in this case. So we have wet, we have dry, and we have intermittent, which is this yellow color here. And intermittency is kind of something we came up with, defining it as back-to-back stretches of stream that are wet and then dry, wet and then dry, all chunks of less than 50 feet. So this is what we're gathering in the field. We're not gathering a class of intermittency in the field. We're processing it on the back end, and then you spit out line that looks like this with our nice little intermittent yellow sections mixed in there. So that's what I mean by intermittency. And then we're going to go straight into Baseflow. So these are the conditions on the stream at the dry survey of the season, the least amount of wet habitat available. Generally, that was the last survey of the season. The date is located down here. This is October 18, 2017. And in Dutchbill Creek, generally what we saw was drying in the lower half of the reach around Tyrone Road, for any of you familiar with that area, along Bohemian Highway. Everything below there was generally dry or intermittent, but above there was predominantly wet. And the same story was true in 2018. The break between wet and dry is actually the same riffle if I go back and forth here, essentially the exact same spot. Despite this being a drier year, still almost entirely wet into the upper reaches. And then 2019 being an above average water year, you see that blue line stretch down towards the mouth. So we got a little bit more length there, but still some patches of intermittency up here and some very tight breaks you can barely see with this scale. Green Valley Creek, unlike Dutchbill, we're not doing the entire length of the stream, but actually starting around the Green Valley Road crossing, so river kilometer 7 or so. This is the Atascadero confluence. And doing this reach up here, we saw mostly more a patchwork of intermittency where we had pools separated by dry riffles, so not the extensive kind of long range drying we saw in Dutchbill, but more broken up. 2018, similar, but probably a little bit longer stretches of intermittency in here. And then 2019, our wettest year, we were almost seeing entirely blue line streams with just very small patches broken up in there. Mill Creek, that's 2017. We tended to see our drying centered around the Middle Felta confluence area and below. Most of the upper basin would stay wet, intermittency creeping up through Felta. Our dries here 2018, that intermittency goes all the way up to the Wallace Creek area, and Felta goes almost entirely dry through what we call Felta Reach 1. Our wet year, we see similar, but a little bit more of the upper basin stays entirely wet, and we retain a few pools down here low in the reach. Right, and then included this just to give you an update of what 2019 kind of looked like in the paces are drying. So each of these samples, the proportion of wet, dry, or intermittent, and this is our base flow at the end. So in Dutchbill, we ended up with 64% of the stream wet. In Green Valley, we ended up with 96 as low, but there's a seasonal dam release on the stream, so that bumped it back up to almost 100% by the time we were done surveying in October. And then Mill Creek, final survey is driest, 81%. So it kind of gives you an idea of that pace there. And then breaking down base flow by watershed and by year. Dutchbill Creek averaged out 60% of the stream length remaining wet at the end of the season, within a range of plus or minus 9 over the years. Green Valley averaged 81% with a wider range between the years, 26%. Mill Creek 77, an 18% range. And Felta was consistently our driest with 56%, 22% range. So I thought this ranging was kind of important to include. So it's kind of an indicator of the environmental sensitivity of these streams to our water years. So give or take a few inches of rainfall in the winter could actually make a huge difference by the end of the season. So you can see now just above 40% in 2018 in Felta, and 2018 is the worst in every one of our streams, just about 50% in Dutchbill. So should also couch that in terms of our water years. 2017 and 2019 were above average, and 2018 I keep referring to as the driest year, but really that was an average rainfall year for us. So if you want to really gauge what to expect, this is more of the average. We also were paying attention to the timing and location of our first disconnections through the season, and why we care about that is because more days of disconnection are correlated with lower juvenile survival through the summer. That helps us identify areas of chronic flow impairment in the stream. It also kind of started the clock for us to pay attention to fish rescue needs, and depending on how early these barriers or how early these disconnections occurred, they could potentially be barriers to smolt outmigration through the season. So in Dutchville Creek, we saw disconnections at the same couple of riffles, the same complex here in 2017 and 2018. The dates are down here as well, occurring a few weeks earlier in 2018. 2019, the timing was similar to 2017, but took place at the Camp Meeker fish ladder, which is a series of step pools with a pretty sizable elevation change. But you can see disconnection in an area like this could potentially impact smolt outmigration if it occurred early enough in the season. So Green Valley Creek, 2017, we saw widespread small disconnections fairly late in the season, early August. It was as early as July 4th in 2018 in this Nutty Valley Creek area, which is similar to 2019. However, that occurred 2 weeks later. So an average water year versus a high water year really buys you only 2 weeks of time before things start to disconnect. And then the Middle Felta watershed, consistently drying occurred at the Felta mouth. And 2018 also was simultaneous with the disconnection of the Mill Creek mouth. And timing-wise, this occurred consistently in mid to late June. And yeah, when that started to dry, it was always big chunks and not little broken up sections. So this doesn't have great scale, but that's a few hundred meters there. Right, so transitioning to reds, we are overlaying the locations of salmon and steelhead reds that we collected during winter during CMP surveys, Coastal Monitoring Plan, and overlaying that with our late season Baseflow to get an idea of where these fish are spawning and whether those areas are predisposed to drying or not. So in Dutchville Creek, we consistently saw spawning occur in the upper reaches that remain wet through the season. So this is 2017, and then we move to 2018, and it's the same story. Almost all of our reds are here in the zone of staying wet. In 2019, we have all of them up here except for one straggler down low. So that's good news. A little different story in Green Valley where we had reds spread pretty evenly throughout the reach, but more of that patchwork effect where, depending on which riffle these fish are choosing, we might go intermittent or dry. Also included Purrington Creek here opportunistically through late season Baseflow that was done there. So that generally stayed wet through Purrington also. You see that again in 2018, just kind of a mix, patchwork through Green Valley and everything staying wet in Purrington. 2019, we had a wetter year, like I've been saying, and so we only have a couple of intermittent or dry reds mixed in there, and quite a few reds to boot. 2017 in Mill Creek, pretty wide distribution through the reach, but our concentration is mostly down here in the areas of dry intermittency, and that is the same in 2018, but that intermittency creeps up towards Wallace Creek again, so a few more of these reds that would have been fine the previous year are going to be struggling a bit more. I'm sorry, kind of freezing up a little bit. Right. So that's 2018, and then 2019, higher water year, so fish push all the way up into the upper basin. But it's still a really popular area for fish to spawn down here around the confluence. So losing a lot of potential recruitment down in that area through all of these years. Sorry, I'm going a little slow. Got a spinning wheel, it's not a good sign. we back? Okay. Threatened to fail on me, PowerPoint. So our base flow in relation to reds by watershed and by year. Dutchbill Creek, the number of reds, or the proportion of reds rather, that stayed wet through the season was 90%. But I included the N value here so we know how many reds we're talking about, to give you kind of an idea of the weight that each of these streams are carrying. Green Valley, 69% of our reds were in areas that stayed wet ultimately, but we're talking about higher numbers of reds, as many as 44 reds in 2019. Oak Creek was even lower, 61%. Again, a good number of reds, though, between 22 and 44 reds over the sample years. And Felt Creek as low as 42% on average, and but we're talking about fewer reds in this case. But I wanted to point out that location really does matter, because 2019, we keep saying, is one of the wettest years. We still only had 23, I think that is 23% of our reds located in areas that stayed wet through the whole summer. So you're kind of leaving a lot of potential on the table there. And then in this table, summarized all the streams by year to characterize those years. So 2017, 72% of the reds were in areas that stayed wet. That dropped to 55 in our average water year. So that's pretty poor, really, 55 in an average year. And that came up to 77 in our above averagely wet year. And then snorkeling and juveniles, this is what people think we're out doing every day in the streams. But reality looks a little bit more like this. This is lower Dutchbill. Trying to find somewhere to dive. And so again, overlaying our distributions with Baseflow. So dots are representative of the density of fish. So these are maybe 50 or less fish per dot. And our concentrations of juveniles are mostly in areas of wet. A few down here, but really not too many in our areas of intermittency and drying, so that's good. Same thing in 2018, higher density up here, not many fish down here. But 2019, we had a lot more coho. Really is quite nice to see how many fish we had spread out through here, so larger densities, but the majority are still up here, but we're still losing a few fish down here in 2019. Green Valley, higher densities of fish, but spread out pretty evenly. But again, kind of this patchwork. These fish might have a better chance of moving to somewhere that stays wet, since they're kind of adjacent to some pools. Harrington, entirely wet there for everything we saw. 2018, a good number of fish in this year, but again, losing a few in these intermittent zones. And 2019, pretty much entirely blue through here, but you'll notice the bubbles are a lot smaller. We ended up with a lot fewer fish in 2019, so better survival, but we ended up with fewer fish somehow. Mill Creek system, a lot of our juveniles are concentrated in the lower areas of drying and intermittency. They are spread out through here, but in very low numbers. You'll notice that I've tacked on Palmer Creek and Wallace, since those also opportunistically got base flow surveys, but Wallace goes entirely dry. 2018, a lot of fish in this lower Mill Delta area, but a few pockets of good summer conditions for fish up here. But this zone was a little problematic in 2018, but that was not the case in 2019. Higher densities in this section now, but still a lot of fish are choosing to rear in these sections that are prone to drying. So proportionally, Dutchbill Creek, 81% of our fish were located in areas that stayed wet through the summer, ranging 29%. Actually, low came in 2019, surprisingly. Green Valley was 77%, with a large range, dropping as low as into the 50s in 2018. 72% in Mill Creek, and only 42% in Delta, but with a tighter distribution, 15 and 10% ranges. So bringing those two things together, reds and juveniles, by year, we saw in 2017, 72% of our reds in areas that stayed wet, and that equated to 70% of our juveniles. So those numbers are pretty nicely in line with one another. In 2018, our average water year, that was only 55% of our reds, but we eked out 63% of the juveniles. So some of those fish might have been able to move before things completely dried. But again, if this is an average year, that is concerning, that we're only getting 63% of our potential juveniles. In 2019, had a high of 77% reds in areas of wet, and that equates to 75. So again, those are pretty nicely in line with one another. And then in summary then, this concludes 3 years of work under the WCB grant. And through that time, we have identified potential locations for flow enhancement or restoration projects for maximum impact, prioritization, located a few, or identified a few bottlenecks to Salmonid over summer survival. We can now hand off this information to predictive models so we can take a rest from hiking all these stream miles. And if you want more excruciating detail, then you can read our forthcoming report. Has even more of this information and tables in it. So with that, I invite any questions people might have.
Thank you, Troy. I don't see any questions in the chat, so if anybody has them, you can add those quickly. We've got just a minute, and then we'll welcome Hannah if nobody has any questions. And you can always reach out to us too if questions come up later. So why don't we move on to Hannah? Hannah Moidu is a fourth-year PhD student working with Stephanie Carlson and Ted Grantham at UC Berkeley, and her current area of study is aimed at understanding and predicting the drying dynamics of intermittent streams, like these ones.
Exactly. Thanks so much for that introduction. And I'm really excited to present some of this research that I've been working on that has been funded through this grant as well. So yeah, today I'll be talking to you a bit about kind of taking those wetted channel maps and kind of extending them into predicting kind of across the watershed and elsewhere, predicting the distribution of these wetted habitats and kind of the implications that this can have for fish and flow management. So first I'm going to start off, with a bit of background, which a lot of which will be reiterating kind of what Sarah talked about in the beginning, but it's always good to hone it back to these issues, kind of get reminded. So basically, this work is focused on the streams in the Russian River watershed, most of which are intermittent. So intermittent streams are streams that dry at some point of the drying season, and they make up almost 50% of the global river network. And this is especially prevalent in Mediterranean climate regions where there's a high degree of variation in inter and intra-annual variability in precipitation, which drives kind of a very strong seasonal variation in stream flow. And in California, where also intermittent streams make up much of this river network, insufficient summer stream flow, as Sarah mentioned, is a key bottleneck for these species survival. So over the course of the dry season, these streams contract and often lead into a mosaic of persistent wetted reaches or isolated pools that act as the only refuge for these species to survive. And often, once disconnected, these patches differ greatly in their ability to support these species and are, like I said, in this watershed, often insufficient summer stream flow is a limiting factor for the survival of many of these populations, including salmon. So despite these intermittent streams being being required to sustain these populations of these imperiled species, a consideration of the drying dynamics has only really recently been truly considered. So because of this, we wanted to further understand the mechanisms that are kind of controlling the extent and distribution of the wetted channels across the watershed. Because even within the same watershed, not every stream responds the same way. Like we saw, some streams have kind of every year they are wet and dry in the same place, regardless of the antecedent conditions, whereas other streams differ greatly in their response based on how much rainfall or how much precipitation there had been in the previous year. So it's not only important to understand kind of the extent of the wetted channel, but also to understand the stability or how variable these streams are year to year. Because understanding the stream variability in intermittency is also especially important in areas like we live in Mediterranean climates, where both climate and stream flow are projected to be more variable under a volatile climate. So because of this, the main objective of the study is to characterize the patterns of stream contraction and kind of get at those underlying mechanisms that influence both the wetted channel extent, but also the variability. So to do this, it's kind of split into three main sections. So the first is an end of season analysis. So this is evaluating kind of what Troy had presented, the end of season condition of a lot of these streams, and combining that with climatic and physiographic variables to try to develop a predictive statistical model for that end of season wetted channel condition. The second is a reach variance analysis. So this is developing a model to predict and identify the factors that influence the interannual variation in that end of season wetted channel condition, whether it has low variability and it has the same kind of end of season condition, or whether it changes a lot year to year. And then the final part of this is a whole watershed analysis. And that's combining these two models and applying them across the Russian River watershed to kind of get insight into how these streams respond within the entire network. So this work can be important in order to understand the response of the wetted channels across a range of water years to determine also what might influence the stability of these streams given a changing climate, and help managers and conservation authorities kind of understand these streams further. So to start off, the first thing we need to do is truly understand what the patterns of the stream intermittency are. So I know we're all familiar with the Russian River watershed, but I just want to show you this to orient you to kind of which streams were included in this analysis. So like Troy was saying, a lot of these streams were surveyed at the end of the season by the Russian River Salmon and Steelhead Monitoring Program, and they were surveyed at the end of the season using the iPad and the GPS to kind of walk along the stream and digitize where the streams were wet and dry. And then again, they were cleaned, exported, and available online for people to see. And it is pretty fun to kind of like see, or fun or interesting maybe, to see how these streams are changing across the year or year to year. So because I was so these streams have been surveyed since 2012 to 2019, many of these streams. Not every stream was surveyed every year, but many of these streams have been. So it's covered tremendous ground, literally covered tremendous ground. But it is interesting to see kind of the spread across the water years, because this time period has encompassed both very high and very low precipitation years, as well as kind of the spatial distribution of these streams. It kind of covers a lot of different physiographic and landscape level variables that exist within the watershed. So the streams that I've selected, since I want to understand the variability of the streams, I've selected streams that have been surveyed at least 3 times. And these surveys are an end of the season survey that try to get at the end of the season condition. So the end of the season condition is kind of around that September, October time period, and kind of encompasses or captures the most extreme condition of these streams, the extreme drying condition, which can be important for managers to know as well, to see like where are these streams dry at their most extreme time. So these are kind of the streams that I've included, as well as the times that they've been surveyed. So I think what would be interesting is also to see kind of like how these stream patterns actually exist, like what are the patterns of this stream extent and intermittency. So here I've chosen 2 kind of representative streams. We have Dutchbill Creek and Mill Creek, and these are 2 graphs showing their wetted channel extent from 2012 to 2019. On the y-axis, we have river kilometer, with 0 being the confluence with the Russian River. So we can see that in the lower reaches, Dutchbill Creek, and this is just the wetted channel extent. So along the entire river length, yellow being dry, blue being wet. So we can see that in the lower reaches, Dutchbill Creek is quite stable in its intermittency. It's around the same same extent year to year. Whereas for Mill Creek, we see that changing a lot depending on the year. You can't say that there's like it's not as stable. So this pattern or lack of pattern is kind of consistent throughout the watershed, where there's no unifying pattern of streamflow recession or stream drying, and each stream kind of responds differently. So we know that streamflow permanence varies spatially and temporally, but that's just getting at the patterns. We want to understand also like what the mechanisms are that are driving the degree and distribution of these wetted extents. So to get at that, we'll look at this paper by Costigan et al., which kind of went through or kind of delineated the controls on intermittency. So the paper kind of separated everything into three major categories: meteorology, geology, and land cover. And these are kind of informing my own predictor variables. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. The degree of intermittency increases when the precipitation is of low frequency, low duration, or low intensity. But there's also other more physical features as well. Like in geology, there'd be slope or lithology, drainage area, as well as things like groundwater, urbanization, or deforestation if we're looking at the land cover. So a lot of these are very helpful in understanding how streamflow permanence or intermittency is controlled at a regional scale. And a lot of these were used, informed my own prediction variables. So these are kind of the variables that I included as my prediction variables to kind of get at that intermittency. And a lot of these were gleaned from that Costigan paper, but also some other papers that also looked at these controls. So in terms of meteorology, I included temperature, but also precipitation. And that's not only the total precipitation for the water year, but also seasonal. As we know in the system, it's quite seasonal, the precipitation. So I included that, as well as legacy precipitation. So not just the past year, but also the past 3 years or the past 5 years, to see whether that has an influence as well, whether it's not just the complete antecedent precipitation, but whether a longer term record matters as well, or how does it matter strongly or weakly. In terms of geomorphology or physiography, I included things like geology, slope, upstream area, sinuosity, soil texture, and soil permeability, as well as some land cover variables like land use, impervious area, cropland, and canopy density. So a lot of these are generally available, just GIS kind of spatial variables that are just available online. Some of these are derived through LiDAR mapping, so not necessarily, I wouldn't say they're available throughout the US, but thankfully within this watershed there was a LiDAR flown, and we were able to get pretty small scale or very fine resolution canopy and stuff like that. So the basic framework of the study is combining those observations of the wetted channels with these predictor variables in order to understand what the wetted channel dynamics are. So we have the observations, we have all of those end of season wetted channel maps, and we now have those predictor variables. But now we need a robust way in order to combine them to develop these models to predict kind of the wetted channel dynamics and the variability. So to do that, we used a random forest classifier. So a random forest classifier is very similar to a decision tree, but instead of a single tree yielding a classification, a random forest subsamples the data into hundreds of trees and then uses an aggregation, a proportion, or an average of those trees in order to yield that classification. So as an example, let's say we have a data set. It is then subsampled randomly into 4 trees. In reality, like in my model, there'd be hundreds of trees, but for this example, let's say there's 4 trees, and then 3 out of 4 of those trees were classified as wet. That would mean that for that feature, there'd be a 75% probability or proportion of that feature being wet. So the random forest was chosen because since you're randomly subsampling the data into these independent trees, you're reducing the variance, and you're also reducing the chance of overfitting your data by just having these variables that just because it's randomly subsampling. So I didn't reserve any of these streams to use as validation per se. Instead, I used like a leave one out cross validation, where it was iteratively removing 5 streams for each iteration and using those streams as validation. And then for the next iteration, it would reintroduce those 5 streams and then choose a different set of 5 streams to use as validation. So that was done instead of just reserving 5 streams, because then you reduce the risk of having those 5 streams having some spatial eccentricities that kind of influence the validation. Instead, you're using each stream as a validation in an iterative process. So I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but the random forest model was kind of included in each of the analyses or each of the objectives that I introduced earlier. So if we wanted to go through each of the objectives to kind of see how the model development was then applied to each of these analyses. For the first one, we combined the physical and climatic predictor variables with the end of the season wetted reach proportion to train a model to predict the end of season condition. So basically the wetted channels were aggregated into 100-meter reaches, and each of those reaches, I calculated a proportion of that reach that was wet or dry, and that was kind of used as the observation in these 100-meter reaches, just because a reach is kind of a more, it's harder, you get a lot of like local influences when you're looking at the very individual scale, but when you're aggregating into a 100-meter reach, you have less of a chance of spatial autocorrelation and things like that. For the reach variance analysis is very similar, except instead of those wetted channel as being the observation, we used the variation in the wet end of season wetted channel response. So if a location was wet throughout all of the surveys, then it had a low variance, or if it changed drastically, like in that Mill Creek example, then it had a higher degree of variance. So that was combined with the physical predictor variables in order to train a model to predict reach variance. We then combined both of those models and applied them across the watershed, the lower and middle reaches of the Russian River watershed, to then see how it would to then predict with the condition and variation within those larger, like more broadly. We did not include the upper section of the Russian River watershed just because the LiDAR data wasn't available for that. So we just kept it to the lower and middle reaches. And then that was delineated for these 100-meter sections along the entire watershed. So now going on to the results for each objective, we'll start off with the end of the season analysis. So on the left here, we have the prediction for each of the years. So this is not the actual data, this is the prediction for each of the years for the two example streams we had earlier, Dutchbill Creek and Mill Creek. And then this on the right is the actual variance of these streams. So as you can see, even in the lower reaches of Mill, where there's a higher degree of variation between the year-to-year response, the model does capture that, and you can see that the model can capture that kind of variation. And even for streams that have lower variation, it does capture that. If we want to quantify model performance, this model had a R-squared of 75.8, and we do see that if we compare the average ground condition to the average predicted condition, they are quite similar. The graph on the bottom right here is showing the variables that were associated with predicting the end of the season wetted extent. And a lot of these are climatic, which makes sense. And a lot of these are not only seasonal, some of these are physical as well, included the permeability of soils and also some geologic classes. But a lot of these are seasonal precipitation, but also longer term precipitation records. We see that cumulative precipitation from not the past year, but the year before, previous year, as well as the previous 3 years and the previous 5 years, all came out as quite important variables in having predictive power. So this kind of points to the hydrologic memory of the system, which is interesting because hydrologic memory can kind of create a buffer from volatile conditions. If you have an unusually dry year, it may not have a proportional effect on wetted extent if there had been wetter years before that, because it can kind of act as a buffer for those regions. But of course, hydrologic memory is not spatially homogeneous, and it depends on kind of the underlying physical structure and the storage capacity of those systems. So we kind of wanted to get at that a little bit. So we looked at the influence of the long-term precipitation, like the previous 3 years precipitation, as well as some more physical variables as well. So these are partial dependence plots. I'll just walk you through because there's like 3 variables all combined in the same thing. But on the y-axis, we have the proportion of the watershed or the proportion of the upstream area that is underlain by this type of rock. So on the left, it's sedimentary rock, and on the right, it's metamorphic rock. And on the x-axis, we have the cumulative 3 years previous precipitation. And the color is wettedness. So yellow is dry and blue is wet. So of course, it makes sense that if there is more precipitation it's more like a reach is more likely to be wet, right? More water, wetter. But what is interesting is that if we increase the proportion of the watershed that is, or the upstream area that is underlain by sedimentary rock, it kind of amplifies the influence of that long-term precipitation. Whereas if we have a higher proportion of metamorphic rock, it actually dampens that influence. So it's not only important, like the hydrologic memory is not only important, but it also is important about where in the watershed we're looking and what that kind of physical structure is. So moving on to our second objective, which is the reach variance objective. On the left here, we have a plot combining variation as well as condition. The main thing to look at is just the purple. So the purple is basically a reliably wet area, somewhere where there is low variation and a high proportion of wettedness. So actually most of the streams that were surveyed, the 50% of the reaches are reliably wet, whereas only 2% are reliably dry. So a lot of these either have a high degree of variability or are very intermittent, but 50% are reliably dry. And this model had a predictive capacity of 92.6 for the R-squared. And a lot of the variables that were important were variables associated with the subsurface or near subsurface, like soil texture and different soil texture, soil permeability, and different geologic classes. So in addition to the first objective, which was understanding the extent of the wetted channel in a given year, the variability of the stream response provides valuable insight as well. So a lot of current management decisions are rooted in climatic stationarity, which kind of fails to incorporate a shifting climate regime, especially for regions that are predicted to become even more volatile. So in California, if we look at these bottom panels, this is from a paper by Swain in 2018. This is showing that in California, like this is California right here for each of these, there is predicted to be an increase in frequency of extremely wet, extremely dry seasons, and a change in precipitation whiplash. So going from dry to wet really quickly. So because of this projection of increased volatility and variability, it's important to have models, or it's important to understand kind of variability of our systems to be able to identify regions that will be stable regardless of antecedent conditions. Areas with low variability, which are stable in their end of season condition, can act as a climate refuge or act as a refugia for different organisms, whereas other areas that have a high variability are more vulnerable to changes in that antecedent condition and do not have necessarily a reliable habitat year to year. So to address our final objective, we then applied these models across, like I said, the lower and middle Russian River watersheds. So here on the left, we have the application of the end of the season condition, and on the right, it's the variability, with blue being, on the left, blue being high proportion of wettedness, and on the right, purple being low variability. So as you can see, a lot of the areas we can see in the circled area, this region is quite wet, like it has a high proportion of the reaches that are wetted, and that area also has a low variability. So we can identify certain regions in there that are likely to stay wet year after year, regardless of those antecedent precipitation. And this understanding of where water will persist in the watershed, as well as kind of the geomorphic context that will support it, can help us determine where those habitat refuges are. And kind of, especially in these systems that support kind of endemic or imperiled species, a lot of these areas can be the only buffer from a local extirpation and things like that. So this is even more underscored in these systems that are highly variable. So the results from the study have pretty clear implications for management. Understanding where viable habitat may exist within a network is a key management concern. But like I said, existing strategies are often associated with static conditions. A recent paper by Tonkin et al. Called for novel strategies to adaptively manage river ecosystems that focus on models that incorporate this increase in climatic variability. This study kind of aims to address that by combining that end of the season model with the variance model to identify reaches that are buffered or that are more reaches of concern because of this difference in variability from the climate volatility. So you can characterize kind of streams that are more sensitive or more buffered from climate. So the ability to predict where these wetted channels will persist through the dry season is also critical for other strategies like river restoration or habitat recovery strategies. Like Sarah was saying earlier, we obviously don't want to get to a point where we're doing fish rescues, and that is often done in watersheds like these, but these tools can be used at the beginning. These tools require only necessarily that winter's precipitation, so you can use these tools and kind of predict what that summer will end up looking like at the end, and use that information to inform decision-making for fish rescues, habitat restoration, where to monitor, or whether or where to curtail water withdrawals if that is necessary. So I know I've talked a lot and there was a lot of information, but just to reiterate some main points, the main point was understanding the spatial and temporal distribution of these wetted channel extents and kind of trying to understand what those underlying physical variables are that support that. So by combining the field observations of wetted channel extent with the physiographic and landscape level variables, we developed two models to predict both the extent and variability of the wetted channel network. So climatic variables were, we found that climatic variables control the end of the season wetted network with an emphasis on long-term hydrologic memory, and that was not spatially homogeneous, that largely depended on the underlying physical structure. The physical structure also influenced the stream variability. And given the climate predictions calling for increased volatility, these models that incorporate climate variability are beneficial in order to direct resources and inform decisions. So I think I'm exactly out of time, but I just wanted to thank you all, especially the Russian River Salmon and Steelhead monitoring team, because they collected all the data, and it was really awesome to work with you guys and also get to know you and kind of be able to do this project. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. The feeling is definitely mutual. What a great collaboration. It's really exciting to see the data used in this way. We have about a minute for questions, and John Green was wondering whether the model can incorporate anthropogenic influences on flow, such as water releases and actions creating flow impairments.
Yeah, so it definitely can. I have not included that. Anything can be used as a predictor variable, and that is definitely something that is important in these systems where there is a lot of withdrawals and water users. So I wasn't able to get enough data to be able to incorporate that, but if that was available, it would just add that resolution that might take it from like decent predictive power to even better, because it I think if you incorporated it, then you could be able to understand how it would change given certain diversions and withdrawals that are occurring.
And real quickly, what state is it in now? Like, what do you see as opportunities for like immediate or near future use by resource managers? What would that take?
So it's definitely like, I think it's ready for use within like the Russian River watershed, especially because it is mostly trained with Russian River watershed data. So it is very much attuned to the system. I think if you were applying it elsewhere, it would be nice to have like ground truth, especially if it was like a similar climate regime and physiographic variables, I think it can be applied. But if it's largely very different, either some ground truthing would be in order, or I'm working on remote sensing tools to be able to kind of, instead of doing the wet dry mapping by like in the field, to be able to use some remote sensing opportunities. So I think that would be a next step, but I think it would be ready to use at least within the watershed to kind of understand maybe after this winter how this 2021 summer would look and kind of be used for that.
Okay, great. That answers most of Marianne's question. And also, she asked it in addition to me, is this published anywhere?
So this isn't published yet. We're compiling it all now, but hopefully we're hoping by the end of the year, but I feel like there's always these last minute changes, but.
Okay, well, really great work. We're looking forward to that. We're gonna move on to Elizabeth. Elizabeth Ruiz works with our program, and she's contributed immensely to this project. She's done hours and hours and hours of field data collection and supervision and helped to organize some of that effort, spearheaded the associated water quality assessments, and she's been working on interpreting the data and summarizing outcomes for our flow release and water quality monitoring efforts, and she's going to go over the flow release outcomes now.
Cool. Thank you. Hello to everyone. I hope wherever you are, you're enjoying these wonderful blue skies and the sun and the beautiful weather we've been experiencing. So I'll be talking about the flow release monitoring that we did on 2 lower Russian River tributaries. So that is going to be Dutchbill Creek and Green Valley Creek. Both of these streams are priority streams. You've heard their names a couple times today already, but they've been the subject of a lot of different work by a lot of different people, and coho salmon and steelhead trout return to these creeks every winter. So they're pretty important in terms of salmon and steelhead recovery in the Russian River Basin. What's important to note about these streams is that there's no one big water user. The watersheds are mostly residential, and so there aren't really a lot of opportunities for really big scale stream flow improvement projects. So as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, the rates at which water released are pretty low. So 1/10 of a CFS right here, that's a little bit less than 45 gallons per minute. And then on the lower end, that's about 9 gallons per minute. To put that in perspective, like the average kitchen sink is like 2 gallons per minute or something. So pretty small amounts of water on the grand scale of things. And you can see that there are 2 releases on Green Valley Creek and then 1 on Dutchbill Creek. So small-scale flow releases have been used as a tool in the Russian River Basin and in these streams specifically since 2015. And we've learned a lot over the last couple of years about their use and how to monitor for them and what kind of shape this looks like in the creek and what kind of impacts we can have. We know that when they are timed correctly, they temporarily increase stream flow, which also increases surface flow connectivity and water quality, both of which are pretty critical for getting juvenile salmonids through the summer season. So indirectly, we can increase the probability of fish survival. However, because they're kind of small and in the past have been more opportunistic, they do present some challenges in timing and monitoring. And if you leave here with nothing else from this conversation, I really want you to know that they don't address the underlying factors that are limiting summer stream flow. This is a very seasonal solution. It's meant to be a part of a bigger stream flow improvement monitoring and improvement plans. So this is just one small component of what we can do for the fish in the summertime to get them through. And again, just to iterate like how small of, like the proportion of water that we're putting back into the creeks is pretty similar to what is present in the creek at the time. So in some years there's 0 stream flow at the time of release. So on the left here is the stream flow before the release. The orange is the average release amount, the rate released into the creek. And then the blue, the darker blue here is the stream flow after that release has kind of taken hold. So you can see in Green Valley Creek in 2017, we released about 1/10 of a CFS. There was no water there at all, and it was successful in completely rewriting the channel, and stream flow went from 0 to 0.2 CFS. So pretty drastic changes. You can also see it's pretty variable. I will say that there are some caveats with some of these years. So in this instance, it looks like we got a tremendous amount of water out of the release in the Camp Meeker Parks and Recreation effort on Dutchbill Creek, but there was some additional water that came into the stream caused by a fire hydrant break. So sometimes it's very difficult to track the different impacts and really quantify them. There's a lot of different things going on in the creek in the summertime. So when you start getting into monitoring for, there's a lot going on out there, and sometimes it's difficult to attribute the impacts we see in the stream directly. So that is part of the challenge. So I'll just go over a couple examples from the grant period. I'll start with Green Valley Creek in 2017. So this map is pretty familiar to you. Troy showed it. It is Green Valley Creek. The distribution of juvenile salmonids seen during the early season snorkel survey are demonstrated here in the circles. The stream condition, wet, dry, or intermittent, is the color code. blue, yellow, or red. The two releases, Green Valley Farm release is up here, Jackson Family release is here, and the direction of flow moves from this top portion of the screen down in this direction. So that is the direction of flow. And what's interesting about this year is in 2017, we've been talking a little bit about how it is a wetter year, so there weren't any releases planned. So there wasn't really an anticipated need in this year, but given the amount of, or the distribution and the number of salmonids in the stream, and the fact that the stream was documented as drying and isolating fish in the pools over the course of the summer, partner agencies, especially like the Coho Water Resources Partnership and all of the collaborators here came together to put water in the stream for the fish at a critical moment in time. So the timing is a little bit later in 2017 compared to different years, but it was something that was done kind of adaptively. So we didn't think we would need it, and then conditions were worsening for a very large number of fish. Almost 3,700 juvenile salmonids were observed in that stream that summer, so it was really imperative that we get water back in the creek. And so the impacts to dissolved oxygen and stream flow are pretty obvious. Unfortunately, the gauge was removed at the late season here, so you can't necessarily see the long-term impacts, but what we can see from this is stream flow really tanked at the beginning of September in this year, but as soon as you turned on that switch and got that water flowing into the creek, stream flow improves dramatically and quickly. And the impacts to dissolved oxygen are fairly similar. So you can see that as discharge approaches zero, the dissolved oxygen concentration in milligrams per liter fluctuates widely before also falling beneath this point, or this 3 milligram per liter mortality threshold that we've pulled from the literature. Marked in green here is 6.0 milligrams per liter. That is the daily minimum objective set by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. So we don't necessarily want dissolved oxygen conditions to drop below this point at any time in the day. So you can see that this, in the earlier part of the summer here, conditions were likely stressful for fish. If these conditions persist through the end of the summer, it's not really conducive to being a fish in the stream. But the good news is when we get that water into the creek, just like discharge, the dissolved oxygen also skyrockets almost immediately. And you can also see that there is a little bit of a delay. It stays better until a few weeks out. So again, this is a later timing. Had we known that we were gonna need these flow releases, we probably should have done them in the beginning of August. However, we have seen fish persist in isolated pools at low dissolved oxygen levels. We don't know the implications of that long term, but we have seen them. So we do know that even in the late season, this kind of relief can make a difference for fish persisting in the streams. Around the same time, so that was the uppermost release on Green Valley Farm. Around the same time in 2017, there was a flow release on the Jackson Family Winery property. This water comes into the creek below the Bones Road crossing, for those of you who are familiar. And we were able to document the moment of disconnection. Let's see, let's get this playing. The moment of disconnection of surface flow from the creek. Let's see. Excuse me one moment. Let me find my cursor. Okay, that's just a dot. All right, so the important thing to notice here, it's a little bit hard to see, but we have an intermittency logger, a modified intermittency logger, and a game camera up here. We use the footage from the game camera to validate the data that we pulled off of the intermittency logger. So basically this is a modified conductivity logger that's telling us whether or not two anodes on the end of the intermittency logger are connected by water and a current is flowing through them. So you can see in this video, the water is pretty minimal, but it's still flowing. It kind of disappears and then re-wets and then dries completely and that drying completely occurred on September 3rd. So then when we go and we compare this to our environmental data and what that looked like in the stream, we can see in late August, excuse me, stream flow was at about 0.15 CFS. Dissolved oxygen was pretty variable, but fairly typical for this time of year and not horrible. And you can see that as stream flow approaches zero, it's that same pattern. We see a slow decline or a steady decline in dissolved oxygen until the moment of stream disconnection. So as soon as that pool becomes disconnected from the surface flow, dissolved oxygen really takes a hit. And then we can see, like, from the actual creek and the surveys that we were doing for wet dry, the pools are steadily decreasing in size. And then once that flow release is started, we restore the stream flow to conditions that were more typical of the early summer season. So not just with the amount of habitat available for the fish, but also the stream flow and the dissolved oxygen. So really, really big improvements. In this particular example, we were able to re-wet several hundred meters of stream, and really there were fish persisting in these little isolated pools, and we were able to make a difference for those fish. There was not a release in Dutchbill Creek that year, but in 2018, we did flow releases at all 3 sites. Again, 2018 is considered a more typical year in terms of rainfall for the Russian River Basin. But, you know, knowing what we knew with the 2017 releases, we were like, okay, even if it's like a typical year, we should go ahead and plan to do these releases. So the releases were planned for all 3 sites, but unfortunately on Green Valley Creek, neither of the flow releases was successful in getting that water to the creek. And it was an infrastructure problem in both cases. Again, these flow releases started off as really small opportunistic projects. So some of the infrastructure is extremely seasonal, and it clogged these years, and we weren't able to get that water into the creek. And so we were able to inform our partners that this was happening. And this is kind of what it looks like over the course of the season. Like, as we were doing these wetted habitat surveys, we were able to tell our partner agencies and landowners that, you know, the flow release is not working, conditions are continuing to dry, like, here's when we were supposed to have the release started, you know, conditions are pretty critical, the pool is very small, we can infer that dissolved oxygen is of a low quality for fish persisting. And then, you know, just we were able to communicate that this flow release did not work. And we have the evidence from using these wet dry surveys to show that, and to show, you know, what we missed out on with this flow release opportunity. And, you know, the timing was really good here. You can see, you know, between August 6th and August 20th, there was a big change in the creek. And had we been able to get that water into the creek, it probably would have looked, again, more like these earlier summer conditions. So we learned some lessons. Again, it's like a work in progress. We were able to provide that in-season feedback and kind of, you know, assess the problems with the gear. And then the end of season analysis with the dissolved oxygen, with some of the more intensive mapping analysis, we were able to determine that, yes, like, the timing was good. It would have been appropriate. So even though we weren't successful in getting the water into the stream this year, we did come out of it with the understanding that, like, we did what we could at the appropriate time. So this timing was appropriate. And also we were able to work with partners, and especially like at the Gold Ridge RCD, John Green was instrumental in getting some improvements to these sites too, so that for future years, they would be more reliable. Now on Dutchbill Creek, flow moves from the bottom right corner downstream. Here's the Russian River. The flow release site is at the Camp Meeker. It's from the Camp Meeker Parks and Recreational District. It's municipal water. It's released in this area where we frequently get a lot of juvenile salmonids. So just like Troy was saying, like, most of our fish, you know, over summer in the upper portions of this creek. So, you know, we're in a really good position to help fish get through the summer with this flow release in particular. And what is super awesome about this is because it's run by the municipality and because TU are such awesome partners, we have like incredible documentation and really robust infrastructure. So we don't really run into the same kinds of problems. Like we get occasional clogs and things over the years, but it's not to the same level of challenge as what we've experienced on Green Valley Creek. So this release is kind of on the upper end. It's 0.09 CFS, so right around that 40, 44 gallons per minute scale that we've been using in the lower Green Valley release. And again, I just wanted to demonstrate the kind of before and after because, you know, with this release, the upper reaches of Dutch-billed tend to stay a little bit wetter and more connected than the lower sections of the reach. So I wanted to show you before and then like the beginning of the season when flow is almost 0.8 CFS, and then right before the release, you can see that there's a lot of contraction in the available habitat. And then after the release, here's the same reference point. We basically have kind of hit the reset button for fish in these pools. So even though, you know, like we're not reconnecting a lot of stream here, we can improve conditions for fish because things like surface flow connectivity and increased pool volume and pool depth can make a really big difference in fish survival. So you can see that the water, the fire hydrant break occurred right here. So we had an initial increase in pool volume as it began to decline over the course of the summer. And then we had another drastic improvement in pool volume. So not just improving the water quality, but also improving the amount of habitat available for these fish. In 2019, last year, seems like forever ago, we did the 3 releases again, similar amounts. And what you can see is that there is an immediate improvement. The closer you are to the release point, the more drastic your improvement is and the more quickly your improvement takes root in the stream. So this is that uppermost release point on Upper Green Valley. The dissolved oxygen was really low. And then again, we just hit the reset button when you put water in the creek. So if there were fish persisting, they got a break and they made it through until the rain event, you know, picked up in the late season. And then on Green Valley, the lower release on below Bones Road, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the water is always released at night and in 12-hour periods to mitigate for any temperature concerns and also limit evaporation. And you know, at first glance, it might seem like because this was a wetter year, the creeks were so big at the beginning of last season that we couldn't even hike them for wetted habitat. So at first glance, it might seem like, oh, there wasn't really an impact to dissolved oxygen. But when you compare the dissolved oxygen below the release to the dissolved oxygen above the release and outside of the impact points, you can see that the flow release, even in a wet year like 2019, had a really stabilizing impact on dissolved oxygen. So there's only a difference of 300 meters between these sites, but that flow release kept the dissolved oxygen from reaching these like critical moments that the upper, you know, outside of the release that the water experienced. So really, really stabilizing, good benefits, even in a wet year. So even when you don't get the miles, you still cushion and buffer the water quality conditions. Oops, it's going a little slow. So usually folks will ask about water temperature, and I mentioned that this release is released at night to mitigate for water temperature concerns. So for this example, I had 3 different loggers, the 2 that are displayed here, and then I also had an additional one that was even farther downstream. And in addition to the dissolved oxygen measurements, they also take temperature, but my PowerPoint is frozen, so I can't show you the temperature. While this loads, are there any questions? I'm approaching the end of this, so I'll be wrapping up pretty soon if this will show my slides. Any questions while it thinks? Sarah, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm trying to pull up a copy of the presentation.
It's so big, it takes forever to load.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the end is really nice to encapsulate the takeaways.
I know.
Yeah, it's maybe not going to load on time, but.
Okay, well.
A question real quick. Do you feel like in the aggregate of what you've seen that, you know, if you had to choose to release water in a wetter or a drier year, is there a kind of set of antecedent conditions that would be the most where water would have the largest bang for its buck in terms of augmentation?
I mean,
I know it's a hard question, sorry.
That is a really hard question. And I mean, it really, really depends on the stream itself and where the fish are. I think, you know, Hannah made a really good point about talking about how each of these streams behaves pretty differently. So I think the timing is really, really critical, because you could have the same creek, but a difference of 2 weeks could make or break the success of that flow release. So we really want to hit that sweet spot before conditions in the pools decline. So before maybe complete disconnection of surface flow, but then early enough in the season to where it'll get us far enough, you know, into early October when the conditions start to cool. So by some miracle, my PowerPoint is loaded. So here is the water temperature. So this orange is the water temperature in the pool, the study pool. And then there are two other data series here. They're almost identical. And these are two pools. One of them is above the release. So the companion data to the, you know, outside the impact DO series that I just showed you on the previous slide. And then also some data from 300 meters below the release. So above the release and then way below the release, the water temperature is basically the same. So what this is telling us is that the flow release had a pretty short spatial impact to water temperature. And it had a beneficial impact. It brought it down from, you know, almost past 20 degrees at the beginning of the summer to, you know, below 15 degrees. And this, you know, speaks to one of the challenges. I really don't know what caused this big spike in water temperature, and that's just a part of monitoring for these flow releases. The flow release was meant to end here, but yeah, you know, lots of questions to be answered. So it seems like I'm out of time, unfortunately, so I'll skip this last example and I'll just leave you with my summaries. So again, effective at improving conditions, it really, really depends on timing. And there's lots of challenges like failed PowerPoints and, you know, clogged pipes. So it's one component of a flow enhancement strategy, and it's not always available. So looking forward, we really need to focus on addressing these underlying streamflow issues. Thank you for your time, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Yeah, thank you.
It happens to the best of us. Thank you so much. Sorry we had to rush that at the end there, but good overview. And we're going to stay in the same vein of flow releases, but and we have a couple more questions that hopefully we can get to at the end. So stick around. And but we are going to step outside of the work of the WCB grant and talk with a few others who have been doing work to help facilitate flow releases, including Marianne King, who's the director of Trout Unlimited's California Water Project, John Green, who's a lead scientist and project manager at the Goldridge RCD, and Dan Wilson, who's division manager of operations and policy branch chief at NOAA's California Coastal Office. And they've all been doing a lot of good work in this arena of flow restoration. And one of the many things they're doing is working to facilitate the flow releases that Elizabeth just discussed. So I think Marianne is going to start, and you can move to the slide with the brochure on it. Thank you.
I think John's going to kick us off.
Okay, great.
John, do you agree?
Yeah. I thought that was what we voted.
Sorry.
That's okay. So yeah, I'm John Green. I work for the Goldridge RCD. We've been working to implement these flow releases for the last 5 years. First through the voluntary drought initiative process, and then kind of on an ad hoc basis for the last 4 years. And I wanted to kind of follow on to what Elizabeth was talking about in terms of the challenges with these things. I'm a little concerned that there's a tendency to see water releases as kind of a panacea, like this will solve the problem of low stream flow. And I really don't think that that's supported by our experience. So I just wanted to give a little bit of what that experience is. This year in particular, it's kind of been highlighted how challenging these things can be. I mean, first of all, underlying the whole situation is the fact that for most of these flow releases, we don't have long-term control over this water. It's water that essentially we're relying on landowners and municipal systems to donate to us. And so, I think that in wet years, there's going to be a lot more water available than in dry years. And dry years, it might end up being a problem because the landowner or the owner of the water could potentially end up needing that water for whatever their operations are. Second of all, this year was like the banner year for infrastructure problems. All of the releases that we worked on had issues. Camp Meeker release, which has been the most reliable one over the last several years, had 2 interruptions, one because of a fire hydrant that was hit by a truck, another one because they had a problem with their system. Both of those resulted in a few days where water was not being released. And because it's such a dry year, the impacts of that interruption were felt really immediately downstream. We had disconnection in the lower part of the Westminster Woods reach pretty much immediately. And there were plenty of fish in that reach. Over in Green Valley Creek, we had hoped to go back to Camp Meeker for just a second. When we planned out our releases this year, we were talking about releasing up to 0.2 CFS into the creek, which would have been really hugely beneficial because the flows have been so low. It turns out that there is actually a limitation on the Camp Meeker system where we are not going to be able to release more than 34 gallons a minute going forward, and that's less than 0.1 CFS. So the spatial impact of that release this year was more limited than we had hoped it would be. In Green Valley Creek, we kind of had a similar set of problems. At Green Valley Farm, the release was originally planned at 15 gallons per minute, or about 0.03 CFS. It took some doing to get there because of issues with the infrastructure, and over time, essentially the piping that we were using to release that water started to clog up. So it took a little bit more work, and we had a downstream reach that reconnected and then disconnected again because of those problems. I don't think the Jackson family release ran at all this year, also because of issues related to infrastructure. And then we had an opportunity to release a really large amount of water in Upper Green Valley Creek from a reservoir that is 180 acre feet, and that reservoir needed to be drained, and we were working on a long-term agreement with the landowner to do a kind of consistent release over a number of years. When we started that release, it was running as high as 2 CFS, which in Green Valley Creek this year was like a tsunami. But we had to shut it down within 3 weeks because we ran into temperature issues. This is a reservoir that's very deep, and we expected the water, temperature was the last thing we expected to have a problem with, but pretty much immediately we were in the upper teens with temperature, and 3 weeks out we were at 20 degrees. So most of that water was not released, and we weren't able to have that beneficial impact. So for me, this just kind of highlights that we shouldn't be viewing these releases as a long-term solution. This is a really good short-term strategy for improving stream flow. Let's not pretend, and I'm not saying anybody's doing this, but I'm kind of concerned. Let's not pretend that this is going to solve the problem. What we really need to be focusing on, like Elizabeth said, is kind of the watershed and landscape scale factors that are influencing stream flow and that are causing these low flow problems. And just to muddy the waters a little further, I think the only exception to that is where we can potentially tap into municipal tertiary treated wastewater, because to me that's kind of like an endless resource that could actually work as something of a partial long-term solution. But the obstacles there are going to be extremely high cost of infrastructure And then also, I think there's going to be some social barriers to that just because we're releasing wastewater. So anyway, that's my little effort to calm everybody down, and I'll pass it over to Marianne. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Elizabeth. That was great. I just have maybe sort of some footnotes to add here, and I have three little ones. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I've been working on the water rights permitting for the Camp Maker release every year. And the nature of that at this point in time is that we have to do temporary urgency change petitions, so an annual change to their water right to add fish and wildlife preservation and enhancement as a purpose of use and Dutch Bow Creek as a place of use to their permit. And that is because the permit expired, so they need to either go to license, they need to obtain an extension of time, which they're in the process of doing. So it is an annual process, and I just wanted to note that at this point, I think we've got it. It still takes a lot of effort, but we got it pretty dialed in. They have a fair amount of work that they have to do on their end every year, and so Cheryl, who's their admin and steady hand over there, and I have developed a checklist. So we got that part good to go. But one of the pieces that sort of adds to the uncertainty that John referenced is that we need the petition for extension of time to go through before the long-term change can be approved. Otherwise, we're sort of in this annual cycle. And Mariska, who I think will speak after Dan, is going to talk a little bit about this. But our funding for the co-partnership will end in October of next year. So the flexible funding source that we really have to adapt and sort of do these annual types of changes is, finding funding to continue to do that is sort of one of the challenges that we have. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is the slide that's up right now, is that the Coho partnership just finished, like hot off the e-press, a 3-pager on flow releases as a strategy. And so I am happy to, I think a lot of you probably already got that from me, but I'm happy to, for those who haven't, maybe send that to the list, or Sarah, you could send it out to the list of folks who are attending this meeting. And I think our purpose was really twofold. One was to provide some of the data that we have and really show the benefits that we've seen, as Elizabeth described. And the other is that we've been getting a lot of interest and hearing a lot of interest from other parts of coastal California around this as a strategy. And I think people are really interested in it. So a little bit of the sort of cautionary, this is not something to take lightly. There's a lot of work involved. It requires a lot of planning and a lot of consideration. And so there's sort of sections at the end where we talk about things to consider, and it's a little bit of sort of tempering the joy and enthusiasm that sort of comes on the first page of the 3-pager. But I think it's worth checking out. We put a lot of time and effort into it, so hopefully it is useful, and we'd encourage you to feel free to distribute it to your networks. And then just last little note is that there are folks that have done some really creative thinking around permitting around flow releases. And Rick Rogers, I don't know if Dan's going to talk about this, but Rick Rogers had convened a group to talk about safe harbor agreements. And then also Brian McFadden has been talking internally with the Regional Water Board about ways to extend regulatory coverage, sort of depending on the types of releases. And some of that thinking is really interesting. I'm not going to go into it, but if that's something that's of interest to you, feel free, I think, to follow up with any of us. And I think Brian said that would be fine too. So that's it for my footnotes, and I'll leave it there and we can move on. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Marianne. We'll hear from Dan now.
Does this work? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm not familiar with Zoom. We were prohibited from using Zoom for quite a while, but we were able to get through it. I don't think I have anything new to provide that John and Mary Ann conveyed. I will emphasize that I am in agreement. This is not a fix. It's buying us time and to make the ultimate fix, or to make the underlying conditions better. But on the other hand, I think what we're learning from these releases is that they don't hurt, and they seem to be helpful when we can overcome the challenges that we face. And don't underestimate those challenges. They are very large. I'm going to point out in 2018, for at least the Jackson family wines, it was an infrastructure problem, but one fact about that pond is that it's about a half-mile away from the stream, and the family has the workers lay pipe from the pond all the way to the creek every year. That's a half-mile pipe that they end up laying, and it actually traverses property. And so what happened that year is the neighboring property didn't know about the pipe, didn't like the way it looked, and moved it away and saw water leaking out of it, so they turned it off. And we got that problem resolved the following year after we talked to them and educated them, and then we got a new partner out of it. But that's just one challenge, and you would think it's a one-off challenge and that you won't face that another year, the following year. But every year there's a challenge that you don't think you would encounter. So every year there's no such thing as a normal year, except that normal years have challenges, unique challenges. The one that came about this year was really the Walbridge fire. Walbridge fire took off right before we made the request for the Jackson family to make these releases. They had the pipeline in place. When they went to go make it, they realized they needed a couple more parts, and then the Walbridge fire took off, and they didn't have staff to access the property anymore. So we weren't able to make the releases. And by the time they were able to access the property, the stream had gone dry, and we didn't really think, after talking with the Sea, we didn't really think releases were going to be helpful anymore, so we decided not to make them. And so, I guess that's the general message is that these are useful. They are productive, but we're not in control of everything, and we're having to work with partners, and there's going to be unique challenges every year.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. I really look forward to some point in the future we can talk more about safe harbor agreements and other ways we can fund and help solidify some of these projects to address some of those challenges. For now, we're going to move on to Mariska. I think all of you pretty much know Mariska Obudzinski. She's our fearless leader here at California Sea Grant's Russian River Salmon and Steelhead Monitoring Program, and she's also the current chair of the Coho Partnership. And none of this work that we've been discussing would really be happening, or at least not in the same way, without Mariska's resourcefulness and tenacity. She's really an integral part of all of this. She's going to give us a quick update on the partnership and some of the projects we're going to be working on.
Thank you, Sarah. So normally the Coho Partnership holds a TAC meeting every year to give a much more extensive update on all of the work that we've been doing over the year. But as Marianne alluded to, we no longer have some of that programmatic support. And so one of the things we've had to drop is our TAC meetings. So we're trying to sneak in a little super fast mini update on Coho Partnership work in this meeting, since a lot of the people that are on that TAC are here today. So I think most of you are familiar with the Coho Partnership. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, there's tons of groups, other partners beyond the Coho Partnership working on these issues. So but I am going to focus on the partnership. The core steering committee that makes up this group is Goldridge and Sonoma RCDs, Trout Unlimited, OAEC, and Sea Grant. And so for the last 10 years, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has provided programmatic funding for this group to address, just take on this really complex issue of trying to restore stream flow, and primarily by working with landowners to get the water that they need without having to take it or have as much impact on the stream flow that the fish need. Sonoma Water has been a partner in Match to allow us to get those grants. So, let's see. So we are just this week wrapping up our last year of more substantial funding from NIFLF. This coming year, we received some wrap-up funds. And so we'll be writing up a high-level report, just highlighting the work that we've done over the last decade. I think we've completed over 30 projects now. We have also completed 4 manuscripts. We have another 30+ projects that are either in the design or development phases. So there's a lot to summarize and get out there. We're also working on a more extensive report, just going over the partnerships approach, some of our lessons learned, and improve recommendations for how, I don't know, just obstacles that we've come across in trying to do this work efficiently and effectively. So the audience for this report is for other groups and other watersheds who are thinking about doing this kind of approach to tackle these issues. And then also some of our agency partners who are involved with helping implement these projects. With some of the, just some feedback on things that have made it challenging to do these projects effectively and efficiently. And then towards the end of the year, the end of next year, so next fall, we'll do a final TAC stakeholder meeting to present the results of those 2 reports. And then one last piece that I wanted to mention that we'll be working on is writing up the results of a study that we've been partnering with UC Berkeley on. And that project was largely funded by WCB, but also some NIFLF funding. So we've collected 2 years of field data for that, and we'll be analyzing and writing some of that work up this coming year. So without this programmatic funding, we have to decide how we want to go on. And this group has worked so well together, and we're really committed to continuing. We are, even though we've done so much, there is so much more to do to improve stream flow in these watersheds we've been working in and beyond. So we're committed to continuing, but it's just going to be a lot more piecemeal, approach, like just patching funding from different sources together. So it's not going to be as efficient, and we're not going to be able to do things the way we've done them, or probably as much. One other little change is we're expanding the scope. We've focused on 5 watersheds. We're adding in Porter Creek. You've probably heard about some of that work that we're doing with UC Berkeley. And then Tania Creek as well. That's one that through our CMP monitoring, we've identified as a really important stream for fish. And then through opportunistic wet-dry mapping, we've learned that it's highly flow impaired. So we just really wanted to add that one to the list. So we've been really busy trying to find other ways of continuing as a group. So we've really made an effort to apply for some WCB funding. So these are 3 projects where multiple partners from the Coho partnership are involved. These are ones that we received funding for from last year's cycle. So Mark West, we're planning to do 10 Streamflow enhancement projects, and that grant will also allow us to continue with some of the flow and environmental monitoring that we're doing there. Mount Gilead is a camp on Green Valley Creek that uses a lot of water, and Goldridge has been working with them. It's high up in the watershed, and it is this incredible opportunity to offset, you know, what's a lot of water in our world of these tiny flows in the summer, over 3 million gallons a year. So that's just this really cool opportunity. So this grant is going to fund to take that project to full designs, and then it's also going to help support some of the monitoring that we're doing in Green Valley. And then I mentioned Pena Creek. So this is a watershed we're not as familiar with, and we received WCB funding to do a scientific study there to just really do some intensive monitoring, looking at flow and some of the environmental characteristics to just really scope it out and figure out a plan for addressing stream flow in that watershed. And then we're continuing to seek funding elsewhere to continue as a group. We submitted in this year's 2020 WCB cycle, we submitted a proposal for Mill Creek, 18 water storage projects, and then some continuation of the monitoring. And then I wanted to mention another one that TU submitted. So one of the real, you know, sad things that's happening with loss of this programmatic funding is that long-term flow gauging that TU does, that all of us use. So they're really having to piece things together, you know, operate in a gauge here and there through different grant sources. So they've submitted a proposal to improve, just continue and improve their gauging network, and added a component of creating a data portal so that all of us can access that data more easily. And then I don't have time to get into it, but there's also, you know, our group has sought funding from WCB and other sources just for specific design and implementation projects. I did want to just bring up a real immediate funding need that our group has, and that's the role that Katie Robbins has played. Linda Tandle prior to Katie. Katie's the project manager, one of the project managers at Sonoma RCD, but so she's really involved in project development and implementation, but a portion of her time has gone towards coordinating our whole group. Katie is the glue for, you know, allowing our group to communicate and work together and be as effective as we've been able to be. She coordinates our partnership meetings, TAC meetings, reports that we put out, grant proposal preparation. You know, there's a lot more of that now. She's done a ton of work on our website and keeps that updated. And then she also does a lot of the project tracking and summarization. So a lot of you guys out there like need to know what's been happening in the Russian in terms of stream flow, and you request that kind of those summaries from us, and we're able to provide those pretty quickly, and that's because of the work that Katie's doing. So this is my pitch. If any of you know of sources of funding to support Katie, we have until next October, and then, you know, we're no longer going to have her able to support our program in the way she's doing. It's about $20,000 a year for her time to be able to do that. So that's my quick update. There's a lot more that we could share, but I'm going to encourage you to visit our website. Katie did a whole revamp of this. over the last year. So there's a lot of really great information and updated information. You can download our Streamflow improvement plans. There's some resources for landowners. So please check that out. And I think we're probably overdue for our break. We're just a little bit over. So let's take that now and let's see. Yeah, let's keep on track. We have about a little less than 15 minutes for a break. And then we have some great talks coming up in the afternoon. We have another UC Berkeley student that's going to be Brian Castle, who will be sharing what he's been putting together for looking at flow and juvenile salmon outmigration. And then we have some really updates that I'm looking forward to from some of our partners talking about the work they're doing on some of these Russian River tributaries. So let's all plan to meet back at 2:30. Thank you.
He is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. He's working with advisor Ted Grantham, the Sea Grant team here at the Russian River Salmon and Steelhead Monitoring Program, because I needed to say that one more time because it's not a very good acronym, and Stephanie Carlson to explore how water depth and flow in Russian River tributaries affects coho outmigration. Really interesting.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Sarah, for organizing this entire meeting. Yeah, I'm excited to tell you about this ongoing work that's exploring how water depth may impact the outmigration of coho salmon. And with that, hopefully give you all a few insights into better catering flow recommendations that can support this kind of outmigration, while also adding a tool to your toolbox as far as potentially using the riffle crest thowweg depth as one very ecologically relevant measurement in these tributaries. And so in this opening slide here, you'll see the location of the riffle crest positioned here by this rebar pin. And I'll tell you about this approach as we move forward. But first, I'd like to, little spoiler alert, give you a few key takeaways that I hope you'll end up taking back from this presentation. One is just that preserving the outmigration window, that duration of downstream migration of the smolts, really is critical for coho conservation. Water depths measured at these riffle crest thowwegs, hereafter known as RCTs, are in many ways more ecologically relevant than flow alone. And I think that's certainly the case as we explore downstream migration and impairment from shallow water depths, because we do see that shallow RCT depths impair outmigration. But with that, flow, of course, is still essential to understand and what's needed. So flow recommendations can be calculated using stream-specific RCT rating curves, effectively rating curves that use water depth measured there at the RCT. So the broader picture of all of this, of course, number one is that water depth alone doesn't necessarily account for all variability in outmigration timing, but it may play a role. So let's keep this plot here in mind that shows some variability in the daily detections of smolt outmigrants, and consider what's affecting that. And we first need to go back to a pretty substantial body of literature that does explore some of the controls on outmigration in a number of systems. But these systems are largely not in Mediterranean climates. And that's why water depth plays a more significant role in these systems. But these other drivers do include endogenous controls, a number of environmental controls, cumulative water temperature certainly is a significant driver and correlated very closely with water depth, discharge as well, the flow, the day length, and even the lunar cycle. Increasingly, gradient and productivity in the streams are also being explored as contributing to variability in outmigration timing. And so for my study, I'm focused on 4 streams, including Mill, Porter, Dutchbill, and Willow Creek. And because outmigration as close in time as possible to their leaving of the entire Russian River system, I'm focused on the downstream-most portions of these streams, and my study areas are about 1/2 to 2 kilometers in length. And so I feel really lucky to be able to utilize this terrific data set that Sea Grants put together on outmigration timing, from which they've used pit tags and the pit tag antenna arrays. I've complemented that with discharge measurements throughout these streams, largely with the flow tracker. And so let's get into the riffle crest, the RCT specifically, and how it's measured here. So, the riffle crest, of course, is this geomorphically repeating feature longitudinally in the stream system that is really the shallowest point encountered repeatedly by an out-migrating smolt. So that's already a reason that it's ecologically quite significant. And then we focus on the Thalweg, the deepest part in the cross-section, because that is likely going to be around the area where smolts migrate. And we measured 12 RCTs per stream day in the systems. And per stream, we have more than 16 stream days of data. And so I'll walk you through some of the methods and even data crunching I did here, largely because I'm happy to share a lot of it if it becomes useful. So for example, in Willow Creek, I've developed rating curves and consequently continuous flow records for all available years based on some terrific data, a lot of which Sarah shared with me. And so that includes 8 years of high and low flow rating curves. Pretty important to piece those high and flow together for the most accurate representation of flow, based on the different colors here, the green for the lower flows, where the gauge depth there on the x-axis and my discharge measurements on the y. Thanks also to Sea Grant and Trout Unlimited for sharing a tremendous amount of flow records from which they've already developed rating curves. And so in many streams, I have more than one set of gauge data available. And so I was able to prioritize the gauge data used based on proximity to the downstream most antenna. That means that I was able to patch that together. So sometimes it's the downstream most ones, sometimes I go a step up if there's otherwise no data available. And in order to estimate what the flow would be at the antenna arrays, which is the area where we care about flow and depth, since that's where outmigration timing is being detected, I did a whole lot of linear regressions to compare the upstream in some cases to downstream gauges, and also in the case of this graph here, did that for a gauge versus the discharge measurements that I took at the antenna array. And important to note here that I'm sure is something you all have recognized in the systems is that in these downstream areas, as Troy and Elizabeth have shown us, and Hannah, there's a lot of infiltration really that occurs at low flows. So there's drastic changes in flow over pretty short distances. And that means that it was helpful to do a low flow regression here, as well as a higher flow regression, in order to accommodate for that infiltration. And voila, after putting all of that data together, I now have 30 so-called hybrid stream years. Hybrid meaning that they come from multiple gauges within a given stream year of flow records to use in this outmigration analysis. And so for all 4 streams, this data spans from 2010 to 2020, some missing years, some gaps in dates as well. But it's for all of those areas nearest to the antenna arrays, in case that's useful for anyone else's monitoring or research. And so here you'll see just an example of one of these flow records here, where the red dots show the agreement to the discharge measurements that I made after conversion. And of course, for my study here on the riffle crest thalweg RCT depths, I needed to convert that flow data into water depth data. And so I did that by developing these RCT rating curves. Again, where we have RCT on the x-axis instead of water depth at a pool. So here, each color represents a different stream. Each point represents a different stream day from which the median RCT value is taken and the discharge measurement is taken. And you can see some really distinct trends among streams, that the streams each really have a very distinct rating curve. And so I use those to generate those 30 stream years of continuous RCT data. And so now if we revisit our outmigration graph here and overlay that continuous RCT data, we can start to tease out some of the potential influences of RCT depth on detections. So just from this plot alone, you know, it's pretty obvious that we're seeing some of these high flow events associated with outmigration, as well as, of course, the perhaps even more important typical season of outmigration that coincides with the flow recession here. And this research, of course, does build on the important work that's also being done or has been done by CDFW's critical riffle assessment method. Their method uses 25 sets of minimum depth recommendation of 12 centimeters that spans 25% of the total width of the riffle and 10% of that contiguous width. And so I wanted to see how detections were occurring as I consider those riffle crest depths. Important to note is that my measurement technique does differ from their measurement technique, but it's somewhat comparable. And if anything, the line, this horizontal line that I plot here for 12 centimeters would actually be a little bit higher because my measurements are taken at the deepest part of the stream. And so from this, we see in these green shaded areas that there's some periods, some extensive periods when outmigration is occurring below that 12 centimeter recommended riffle depth. But of course, a lot of migration is also occurring at depths above that as well. But it indicates that the critical riffle threshold is almost certain to protect smolt outmigration. And now if we start to look at some variability among streams here, Porter Creek compared to Dutchbill Creek, you can see that associated with the shallow depths of Porter Creek earlier in the season than for Dutchbill Creek, we really have a truncation in that outmigration duration by around 3 weeks. So Porter Creek is going dry here, but the water depth is certainly playing a significant role in facilitating or hindering outmigration. And now, so there's 30 stream years of data I've compiled together to develop what I hope can be some somewhat useful plots here. So these are all of those streams during the outmigration season, March to June, 2010 through 2020. On the x-axis, our trusty RCT, and on the y-axis, the proportion, in the case of purple here, of water depths at the RCT experienced throughout that March to June season. So keep in mind that the purple in this case is irrespective of detections. This is simply the frequency or proportion of water depths. So the purple shows that we have a lot of water depths that are really shallow among those tributaries. And now the green shows what is also effectively a smooth histogram, kernel density plot, of the depths during which detections take place. So you can see here that despite a ton of depths that are very shallow throughout the season, there's a preference for outmigration at somewhat deeper depths with this steep drop-off that occurs at this point of RCTs. But I would encourage you to not take these depths as final for developing any recommendations yet. I've got some more graphs to show you first. But let's first zoom in to kind of the shallower depths that we're really ultimately more interested in. And so you can again just see what is the same high frequency of those water depths with this steep drop off under about 3 centimeters RCT of detections. Now let's tease this out a little bit by stream to see if there's some variability among streams and preferences of riffle crest water depths for the outmigrating smolts. And so the interesting thing that comes out of these comparisons now is that, for example, Mill Creek, a lot of these are off the chart for Mill Creek because it tends to get deeper water depths with a more step pool like geomorphology in my study reach. But with that higher frequency of greater depths, there's also the greater frequency of outmigration during those depths. That makes sense, of course, right? That if you have a lot of long duration of shallow depths, then there's a higher chance, as is the case in Willow Creek, for the outmigration to occur during some of those shallower depths. Whereas Dutchbill and Porter Creek have relatively intermediate depth preferences for outmigration. And the way to read the exact quantity on the y-axis on all of these graphs is that for any given 1 centimeter range of RCT values, that is the proportion of outmigrants that outmigrated during that range of depths. So for 10 centimeters depth, looks like there was, or for you could say 10 to 11 centimeters depth, there was, it looks like about 7.5% of the total outmigration for that season. But because in these graphs, as I mentioned, the preferences for outmigration are of course biased towards the frequency of water depths. I wanted to try to account for that. So what I've done here in this next plot is I've normalized the water depths, meaning that I've taken that green proportion in the previous graphs and effectively just divided by the proportion of depths, which means that now on this plot, this is assuming that there's an equal chance of all of these water depths being encountered throughout the season. And so this understandably takes out those spikes in outmigration that are more associated with the higher frequency depths. And so you can see now which is why I cautioned you against taking exact numbers from the previous graph, is that there's a more steady decline in the propensity for smolts to migrate out with decreasing water depths that starts all the way from a water depth of about 25 centimeters. So let's go ahead and look at this data again, parsed out by stream. And here you can see some variability as well. I'd say most noteworthy here is that, there is in each of these plots this very significant drop off at a certain depth in outmigration. So this is cueing us into some notions that, yeah, there may, begin to be some thresholds at which outmigration is significantly less likely. The stream for outmigration becomes impaired at certain depths. And above those depths, it certainly is variable. In many of these cases, these spikes are associated with heavy rainfall events, but it's a little bit less peaked than the previous graphs showed. Most significant just being these significant drop-offs. And so we can start to think a little bit about what depths really do support outmigration based on these data. But I would still caution us against taking exact numbers from these data sets at this point of the analysis, simply because this still doesn't necessarily account for the seasonality. There's this more common outmigration during April and May, and for example, in June, these data are still treated equally, even though outmigration, of course, is less common in June. And I'll be conducting potentially some time series analyses, more complex models to account for that seasonality. But once we want to start converting some of these water depths into flow recommendations, we can go back to these RCT rating curves here. And that, of course, also gives us the understanding of the relationship between flow diversions and the reductions in RCT. So let's zoom into some of these shallower depths that we're most interested in. And looking at our 4 different streams here, or 5 different streams in this case, let's say that we have a water depth target of 7.5 centimeters at the riffle crest Thalweg. Well, these plots indicate that for Mill Creek, that wouldn't be all that much flow because of that step pool geomorphology, only about half a CFS. But for Dutchbill Creek, which is a much wider stream, it requires almost 10 times as much flow to reach that same depth. So I think that indicates that we have kind of a 2-part set of interpretations that can be made from these data. One on the RCTs that support outmigration, but also just on how to use these rating curves for calculating the flow recommendations based on any specific water depth target you may have. And so, with that, I'd just like to conclude by reiterating that these shallow water depths do limit duration and the occurrence of outmigration. So that duration of the season and also potentially how many smolts are then also trapped upstream for the summer. RCT depths that support outmigration do, however, vary by geomorphology, as we saw among those 4 streams. And it's looking like that is associated with the substrate size, the grain size, something I'm also continuing to look into. RCT rating curves estimate flows required to reach desired RCT depths. That's, I hope, a tool that you can all potentially use in your systems. but it is variable among tributaries by a factor of about 9, just underscoring the importance of using those curves. And for me, my next steps that I look forward to continuing to work with you all on are more specifically the drought impacts on outmigration duration and teasing out some of those seasonal controls so we can get a better sense of the exact RCT depths that support outmigration. And with that, I'd like to thank a lot of folks. Just to highlight a few who have helped a ton for this particular angle of the research. Sarah sharing a ton of data and insights. Mariska for supporting the entire project and helping me a lot with the outmigration data. Gabe and Bill Trush for really being foundational in developing the RCT method. Elizabeth for helping a lot with the flow tracker, and Krisha and Mia at TU for sharing a lot of flow data. And with that, I'd love to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm super excited to see where you take that next step further and account for the seasonality, what that looks like, and really pointing to like preferential depths, during the prime or the time when fish are inclined to move by other drivers as well. Really interesting. If anybody has any questions, we have about a minute if you want to type it in the chat. Otherwise, we can move on. And I'm hoping at the end of the meeting, if we have time, at least those folks that are interested in sticking around, we can go ahead and kind of normalize our discussion by just like unmuting and having a conversation if it works out. So I think for now, we're just going to move on to our partners here from DFW. Todd Carlin and Bronwyn Stafford are members of CDFW's in-stream flow program, and they're currently engaged in a study to evaluate in-stream flow needs in Upper Marquest Creek, as many of you are familiar with and have seen some of their work in various stages. Todd is the field lead for this project, and he's been performing a lot of data analysis for it, and Bronwyn is the supervisor who's overseeing the project.
Sounds good. Thank you for that, Sarah. Yeah, so for this talk, I'm going to be discussing an ongoing study effort that is being conducted by the in-stream flow program in Upper Marquest Creek, which aims to assess habitat conditions for juvenile salmonids. As an overview for the talk, I'll first provide a brief background of the study and an update on activities and progress since last year's presentation to this group. Following that, I will present a very high-level perspective of the modeling workflow and the analysis concept. And then lastly, I'll present some next steps for the study. And then after that, Bronwyn will finish up by introducing the second report we'll be releasing for Marquest Creek, which is based on more rapid watershed-wide assessments. So one of the primary motivations for this study was the California Water Action Plan. Action 4 of the plan directs the department and the State Water Board to protect and restore important ecosystems. And Marquest Creek was selected as one of 5 anadromous stream systems in which the agencies were to conduct efforts to enhance stream flow, and in doing so to consider their public trust responsibilities. And to that end, this in-stream flow program study aims to identify flows that maintain connectivity and support rearing habitat for steelhead trout and coho salmon. And our approach was to develop hydraulic habitat models for 3 study sites to estimate the stream flow habitat relationships throughout Upper Marquest Creek. As I just mentioned, our study area is focused on the upper watershed upstream of Calistoga Road. So after the Tubbs fire in 2017, we decided to limit the area of our study to the upper 4.5 miles of the watershed. And this was just to avoid any bank and channel instability issues during data collection. Although we did habitat map that lower section just doing a post-fire assessment. It just you know, didn't seem like a great idea for kind of consistency throughout the course of the study period. So this here is just a map of the watershed, and our 3 study sites are depicted by the red blotches on the right side of the map. And for those of you who are familiar with the watershed's geography, Site 1, which is the downstreammost, is located a little ways upstream of Calistoga Road. And then Site 2 is located a little downstream of Tarwater Road. And lastly, Site 3, the upstreammost, is located upstream of Tarwater Road in the Canyon Reach. And Sites 2 and 3 are in the area of the watershed that has now been devastated by the glass fire. So just to provide some quick context on how the channel form varies by study site. Site 1 on the upper left can be characterized as a semi-confined alluvial channel dominated by cobble and gravel, and it has a few areas of boulder dominated sections. And then Site 2 on the lower left can also be characterized as a semi-confined alluvial channel, but a little more confined than Site 1. And it also has small bedrock outcroppings throughout. This photo here is actually probably the widest part of this study site. But anyway, and then lastly, Site 3 on the right can be characterized as a narrow bedrock confined channel that is boulder dominated. So as an update since our last meeting, we've completed all the field work, including the collection of topographic survey data, depth and velocity measurements for model validation, and all the data needed to develop the stage discharge relationships. And additionally, we're currently in the process of modeling each of the study sites and analyzing the respective output data. And lastly, we've begun drafting the technical report, which will present the data collection methods and findings from the in-stream flow assessments. So to carry out the hydraulic modeling element of the study, we've been using the 2-dimensional component of the Army Corps' HEC-RAS program. And I recognize while each one of these kind of 2D workflow elements could serve as the basis of a short presentation in and of themselves, I'm going to give a really high level overview of the 2D model workflow, though I will go into a little more depth on a couple of these elements in the following slides. So once all the topographic survey data are collected, we can create a terrain model for each study site. And these survey point data are then converted into a raster format so that they can be imported into HEC-RAS. Next, we construct a 2D model using the previously created terrain, boundary conditions established at the upstream and downstream extent of each study site, and a site-wide computational mesh. And this will become clearer in the subsequent slide. And once we have completed these initial model elements, we can go ahead and develop the stage discharge relationship, calibrate and validate the 2D model, and finally develop habitat suitability indices for each of the species using the model depth and velocity outputs. So this slide here shows some of the steps in the model creation process. In this case, it is for our study site 2. So I'll be walking through the graphics from the upper right of the screen down to the lower left. And for reference, the flow would move from right to left across the screen. So we start the model construction with the topographic survey points that are collected in the field. In our case, this was done with the total station. And these are intended to capture the variability in the channel bed characteristics, including the substrate size and roughness characteristics. Next, that kind of middle image there, we go ahead and create the terrain model by using the topo to raster tool and ArcGIS for those that are familiar. And this converts the survey points into a raster format that can then be imported into HEC-RAS. And then after that, we established the model extent, which on the lower left image is represented by the black boundary. And then also the boundary condition lines, which are represented by the thick red lines at the upstream and downstream, downstream extent of the study site. And then lastly, we'll develop that site-wide computational mesh to overlay on the terrain model, which is kind of shown here in this lower left image with the crosshatch layer. And then the next step in the modeling workflow that I think has some exciting graphics for presentation purposes are the depth and velocity outputs from the HEC-RAS model. So here, what we're looking at are the depth outputs again for Site 2, and this is for the 5 CFS simulation, cubic feet per second simulation in the upper right image, and the 40 CFS simulation in the lower left image. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty and contrast the depth outputs during this talk. But through these images, we can see, some of the expected variation in depth magnitude between the two simulations, and then also some of the aerial extent of the wetted channel changes throughout the study site. I'm sorry, I guess I should leave that up there a little longer, apologies. And then to analyze these output data from HEC-RAS, we'll be applying the concept of area-weighted suitability, which is an assessment of habitat suitability that corresponds the model depths and velocities from the range of flow simulations with habitat suitability criteria data. And in this case, thus far, we've been using data from Hollow Tree Creek in the South Fork Eel watershed, although we've also done some comparisons to another steelhead habitat suitability data set that we developed for the Big Sur River, and those results are showing similar patterns in those results. And then for coho, for the coho salmon, we've just been using the Hollow Tree habitat suitability data set. And then once that's done, to compile and process these modeled outputs and to estimate the area-weighted suitability, we've developed a basic Python script to kind of work through that and develop some of the outputs for visualization. And so lastly, next steps, just want to touch on those, finalizing the data analyses, completing the technical report at some point in 2021, and then lastly, giving any follow-up presentations once our results are finalized. And then, sorry, Bronwyn, I took a little longer than we thought, but I'll turn it over to her for the last part on the watershed criteria report.
Great, yeah, and I can keep this brief. So I just wanted to introduce to this group, because I don't think we've mentioned it in our previous presentations, that we're also going to be producing a new style report that we're calling a watershed criteria report. It's complementary to the more in-depth site-specific data intensive process that Todd just described, and uses a variety of different rapid methods at sites throughout the Mark West Creek watershed to try to characterize some different types of ecological needs. And the methods that we'll be using in this report are described in the overview of analysis document that is currently available on our website, along with 2 reports of this style that we have released so far for the Fresno and Ventura River. And maybe go to the next slide and then I can stop there, Todd, if you don't mind. So just sort of as a brief overview of what these reports contain, we divide the assessments that are in these reports into 3 categories: base hydrology, desktop analyses, and then more site-specific analyses that are based on field data collection. So for each of these kind of broad categories of data, we have a few different types of results that we're presenting to help understand both sort of what you would expect as natural variation and pattern, like seasonal and interannual patterns in flow for a reach, and then also some more rapid methods for assessing ecosystem needs, both sort of desktop methods, including using some of the new functional flows work that has been coming out recently, as well as some site-specific methods. And we will be presenting this in more detail when that report is complete and ready to share, which again, we're hoping that will also be in 2021. So yeah, I'm happy to stop there then, and we can take questions if there are any, and we will be back with more details on actual results for both of these reports. And we would look forward to hopefully presenting to this group at that time.
Thank you, Todd and Bronwyn. And look, your timing, I know you cut it a little short, but the timing is right on, and we don't have any questions in the chat. So we're gonna move on, but if anybody comes up with them, oh, wait a minute, let's see. Excuse me, we do have a question. Can you describe what will happen with the assessment once it's complete?
Yeah, I can take that one. So as Todd mentioned at the beginning, this is part of the California Water Action Plan, and so CDFW and the state board are partners under the California Water Action Plan. So we have been working with them, and we'll kind of keep working with them to help figure out the way to implement the findings that we have. And actually, I think that is a good segue to the next talk when they'll be telling us some more about the work that they're doing. But yeah, I think we're still kind of charting the course in collaboration with the board on like how the rollout and implementation of these products work. But yeah, they can speak more to that as well.
Yes, perfect segue. So we are going to hear from Dan Worth and Adam Weinberg. They're with the State Water Board in the Division of Water Rights in Streamflow's unit. And they're going to give us an overview, sticking in this topic area, of the California Water Action Plan in Mark West Creek, as well as also cover flow ecology methods under development in the South Fork Eel, and talk about drought planning at the board. Dan is a senior environmental scientist who manages the California Water Action Plan program. Adam is an environmental scientist and leads staff for the plan for the South Fork Eel River watershed. And they also work closely with Val Zimmer and Bob Selecki on these projects.
Okay, there we go. Hopefully you all can hear me now. Again, my name is Dan Worth. I'm a senior environmental scientist. I work in the Division of Water Rights, and my group works on this California Water Action Plan effort to enhance in-stream flows. And let's see, Adam Weinberg is also going to talk a little bit today towards the end of this presentation. And he'll do some introductions when we get to that point. All right. So I'm going to provide an overview of our Water Action Plan effort. We're going to talk about our work in Mark West Creek and provide some updates on where we're at with that work. Then Adam's going to talk a little bit about the South Fork Eel and some of the work that we're doing in that watershed, which may translate into other watersheds in the future. And then I'm going to provide an update on some of our drought planning in the Division of Water Rights. So as Todd and Bronwyn covered, we're working on an effort that was first identified in the California Water Action Plan. And I'll move through this pretty quickly because I think a lot of you have heard it before today, and then also by Todd and Bronwyn. Basically, this Water Action Plan had an action that directed the State Board and the Department of Fish and Wildlife to enhance in-stream flows in 5 stream systems throughout the state. And the 5 stream systems that we are working on are the Shasta River, South Fork Eel River, Mill Creek, Mark West Creek, and the Ventura River. So there's work that's ongoing in each of these watersheds. And I break our effort down into a few different categories. One of them is trying to identify what environmental flows are needed. And as CDFW staff just talked about, they're in the process of conducting site-specific and watershed-wide flow studies. There's also a lot of research that other groups are doing, and we will take that other research into consideration. And then the State Water Board's also developing modeling tools and regional approaches to help answer some of these questions. CDFW and potentially other groups will make flow recommendations to the State Water Board, and the Water Board will consider these recommendations and other information. And the ultimate goal is to have, to establish an in-stream flow objective and then try to manage water and flows to meet that objective. And that could be implemented through policies or regulations, also local cooperative solutions and agreements, and potentially other implementation actions. So a big part of what we've been doing up to this point in our effort at the State Water Board is developing modeling tools to support this effort. And we have largely focused on surface water, groundwater, and water allocation models. And these modeling systems help us evaluate the unimpaired flow conditions and the natural variability in the hydrograph. And it also helps us quantify and understand water demands and get all that information into one place. And ultimately we'll have, a water budget that helps us understand the fate of water, where water comes from, where it goes, how it's used, what in-stream flows look like at different parts of the watersheds, and the surface water, groundwater interactions are also an important part of our modeling systems. And then ultimately we'll use these to evaluate different management scenarios for in-stream flow. And these modeling systems have 2 different components, at least the way that we're putting them together in our watersheds. They all have a surface water, groundwater modeling system that, that again models where water comes from, where it goes, what flows look like, the surface water, groundwater interactions. And there's also a water allocation modeling component, which is shown by the schematic on the top of this slide. And the water allocation models help us understand water rights and water right priorities and reservoir operations. And we can use these water allocation models to run different management scenarios and understand how the water rights priority system might be affected if there was an in-stream flow requirement, and how different reservoir management scenarios could work. And so together, these modeling tools that we're in the process of putting together will give us a pretty robust tool at the end to evaluate management scenarios and understand the effects of those scenarios. And there's a lot of data that goes into these models. They're pretty data intensive, and a lot of the data is kind of the typical data sources, or I guess more GIS related data, things like precipitation and watershed delineations and geology and land use and agriculture and climate data and that type of information. There's also a lot of specialized data that we've been spending a lot of effort trying to understand and making sure that we're using the best information available. And that includes things like Streamflow gauges during low flows. A lot of our gauges are really designed for flood control, and so we're putting a lot of effort into trying to understand the lower flows, and we've put some gauges out in the South Fork Eel, and a lot of you have put gauges out in the Russian River watershed, and we're hoping to use that information. And then other things like water rights data and water rights place of use. People divert water and trying to understand where that water actually goes. In some cases, it goes through canals and gets kind of piped to other parts of the watershed, and so there's a whole list of data that's maybe a little bit more specialized, and we're spending a lot of time trying to understand. In the Russian River, we have two modeling efforts going simultaneously. We're working with USGS to develop a Russian River-wide surface water, groundwater model. And this Russian River-wide model is something that's being funded and supported by State Water Board, the Sonoma County Water Agency, USGS, and some other partners in Mendocino County. And this is a new modeling effort. We're also in the process of having USGS update the Santa Rosa Plain model. It was originally done in 2014, and we're adding additional years to take us up to, I think, through 2019, so that we can capture these drought years that happened recently. We're also trying to incorporate some of the information order data that we collected during the drought. And these models, we've been working on this effort for a few years now, and these models are getting near completion. They're partially calibrated, and they'll be runnable shortly. And USGS will make them public towards the end of 2021 or early 2022. So this has been a big effort, and it's been something that's been a collaboration between a few different agencies, and it's been a lot of work to try to get everybody to work together, and all of our contracting and funding mechanisms to align, and it's something that we're excited about, and we hope that it's a useful tool for everyone in the future. And in terms of our work in Marquest Creek, as DFW mentioned, they're wrapping up their flow studies, and we're getting towards the tail end of our modeling, putting together our modeling tools. And next steps will be working on establishing in-stream flow objectives. And again, that could be in the form of a regulation or agreements. And there may be a CEQA process that's involved with that. And so that next step will also be a process that takes a few years to complete. And then ultimately, our goal is to have a flow objective that's being managed towards, and there'll be some follow-up with that into the future in terms of adaptive management and enforcement and effectiveness monitoring and diversion scheduling and things like that well into the future. And now I'm going to turn it over to Adam, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of our work in the South Fork Eel. And this work is, it's something we're trying to do to help develop regional methods that could be used. In a lot of this work, we hope to apply to other watersheds throughout the state. And so I'll turn it over to Adam.
Hey guys, thank you. Val thought you guys might be interested in South Fork Eel. It's a little bit sequentially ahead, so we're hoping to move this forward fairly soon. Just a couple of quick notes about the South Fork eel. It's geographically, it's a very large canyon with lots of smaller watersheds that all pour in from the east and west sides. And it's about 19 Huck 12 units in size. One of the big challenges is that you have the diverters in this watershed are very disparate, spread throughout the watershed in the hills, and they're largely unpermitted and not super interested in working with us. One of the interesting challenges also is that the watershed has very similar geology to the Russian River, I think. And in general, except for some isolated areas, there's not a whole lot of groundwater availability. So you have that very similar, I think, drainage where you have huge amounts of water flowing through the watershed in peaks and spurts in the winter, and then in the summertime it goes down to pretty little trickles, even under natural conditions. This watershed is a California Water Action Plan priority watershed. It's also a case study for the California Environmental Flows Framework, which is a statewide effort to try to develop methods for developing in-stream flows throughout the state. So we're trying to showcase some of those methods as well. And I apologize. Dan, you can move on to the next slide. Apologize for the walls of text on these next slides, but I'm going to try to blow through these fairly quickly in the interest of time. There's been a lot of work done in the South Fork eel, including CDFW has conducted a similar study to what they've done in Mark West Creek. They've done in Redwood Creek, which is one of those tributary watersheds that happens to have a lot of very high quality habitat for coho and steelhead, and also has a large amount of diverters there. There's been other work that's been done. CalTrout conducted a study in Sproul Creek, another PHAB-SIM type of study. Our friend Gabe Rossi conducted bioenergetic study in Elder Creek and possibly another location in the watershed. Bill Trush has conducted riffle crest thalweg studies in various locations in the watershed. CDFW Fisheries has a coho monitoring program, and we've conducted streamflow monitoring, seasonal gauges in different parts of the watershed, in addition to some other organizations that have done so. So we have a bunch of data. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into any detail on any of these particular aspects, but similarly to our effort in the Russian River, we're developing a hydrology model to focus on unimpaired and existing conditions, a water allocation model, which is where we're going to bring in a bunch of the other information that we develop to try to evaluate the effects of different flow policies on fish and water users by an in-stream flow policy or various different options for flow policies. A stream segment classification system, which is intended to help aid the regionalization of data, whether it's flow criteria or flow ecology relationships, trying to understand what reaches are geomorphically similar to each other, so we can try to do that sort of regionalization of data. We're developing a water temperature model. The first task on that is trying to identify whether we can see statistically a relationship between flow and water temperature, and if so, we're able to use that in other aspects of our analysis. And then one of the more interesting things that I've been working on over the past year has been working with an expert panel to develop information. Next slide, please. So the expert panel that we're working with, it's composed of state and federal agencies, academics, contractors that we were working with, and other NGOs who are involved in the development of the California Environmental Flows Framework. One of the key things that we focused on here initially was trying to identify what species are considered to be key species for the watershed, and of importance also is, do we have flow ecology relationships for these species? So can we identify those relationships by which a change in flow conditions would result in some change in the habitat suitability for these species. We also wanted to know where are these species found, what is the periodicity for these species throughout the year in these different locations. And then outside of the larger group, we started breaking out into focus groups, I guess you could call them, to try to get the experts in the room who have specialized knowledge on particular topics. So I had met with folks to talk about lamprey. We had another group to talk about temperature thresholds for various aquatic species in the watershed, developing functional flow metrics, and that is ongoing. And then also an ongoing part that I'm going to discuss is flow regime evaluation. Next slide, please. So one of the big challenges that we're trying to work on here is that there's a lot of different kinds of information that we're trying to integrate here. So there's been a variety of different study types: PHAB-SIM study, bioenergetic studies, Riffle-Crest-Thalweg studies. And the end result of all these studies is that you develop these flow ecology relationships. You're developing some kind of a quantitative relationship between your flows and some ecological metric of interest, whether it's weighted usable area, in case of PHAB-SIM, or growth in bioenergetics, or the various things you can look at with Riffle-Crest-Thalweg studies. And then you also have a variety of different flow policy types: bypass flow, percent of flow, modified percent of flow, functional flows, and we're trying to come up with a way of setting up these different possible flow policies, stacking them next to each other, and try to evaluate quantitatively how this might work. And one of the approaches that we've been talking about recently is how to use risk assessment and functional flows to evaluate these flow policy proposals. Next slide, please. And so this is very much still in progress and in conversation. We're trying to understand, exactly, what kind of procedure could we use so we can systematically evaluate different flow scenarios on sort of equal footing here. So the way we're looking at it right now is that you can take different sort of quantitative gateways, you might say. So one of the approaches is functional flows. And I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with functional flows, but it takes your range of variability of your hydrographs for a watershed, and you develop key hydrologic metrics that you are interested in preserving. So it might be a spring recession rate. And in your range of different water years, you'll have a range of spring recession rates. And the idea being that if your flows are within that range of variability, then hypothetically, you're probably resulting in less harm as far as these species are concerned, if you're able to meet the fall within the range of variability for each of these different hydrologic metrics of interest. And I guess I'm going to take a quick step back. The whole idea here is that if you have a flow policy, what you're ultimately doing is you're affecting how and when both the amounts and the timing that water users are allowed to take water and use water. And so regardless of the type of policy that you're developing, you're going to result in some impairment of the hydrograph. And as we model this, we can take each of these different policy options, model it through our water allocation model, and see, okay, how does this, what is the impaired hydrograph resulting from this? 2 minutes, okay. So anyways, we're trying to understand how you can evaluate these side by side. And then next slide, see the quantitative impacts. And then from there, we can then look at the ones that seem to have the least impact on fish and water users, and we can start to then evaluate the practical difference between the different flow policy strategies. in terms of the implementability and the problems you might encounter or the benefits of them. And I guess Dan, if you want to wrap this up with drought.
Sure, thanks, Adam. All right, I don't have a lot to talk about in terms of drought planning, but I did want to mention that there's a effort within the State Water Board to better plan for drought going into the future, and so there's some work that's being done in the Russian River watershed as one of the kind of initial watersheds that we're working on. And you may have heard Dan Schultz talk about this a little bit in other presentations and recently. And we are in the process of trying to do a better job at forecasting water supply and understanding water demand and understanding the water rights priority system, so that when we move into future droughts, we're better prepared to deal with those conditions and curtail water rights if needed, so that water stays within the stream. And so if you have questions about that, you could reach out to me or Dan Schultz. And with that, I don't think we had anything else to talk about. And I guess I just want to thank Adam. Adam kind of put his slides together at the last minute. He was a last minute addition. He filled in for Valerie, and so yeah, thanks Adam for talking a little bit about the South Fork eel. And with that, I think we're done, and we can take questions if we have time.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm sorry to cut you short. Really interesting stuff, and I'm eager to hear more. I'm really encouraged that you're working on drought planning for our watershed. We do have a couple of questions. The first is whether you'll be considering the modeling study of Mark West Creek funded by WCB that's going to be complete in a couple weeks in your determination of recommendations for the WAP in Mark West.
Yes, yeah, thanks for that question, and I apologize I didn't mention it on my slide. On that slide that had the map, there was also some watersheds highlighted that were the watersheds that have been modeled by O'Connor Environmental, and so yeah, there's going to be a variety of modeling tools within Mark West Creek and also in other parts of the Russian River watershed, and I think it is good to have multiple sources of information and different models to look at, and I think that helps bookend what we expect reality to be. These models try to simulate reality, and having multiple modeling tools I think helps kind of put bookends on what we think the true answer is. So definitely interested in the work that has been done by O'Connor in Mark West Creek and in some of the other watersheds, and yeah,
Nice.
we'll be considering those.
Great, I'm glad to hear that. And one more question, I think if we can get through it in the next minute. How will the new environmental flow framework concepts be incorporated into the WAP flow studies? So
I think I was trying to get at that, I think, at towards the end of my presentation slides. And I think we're still trying to work that out. Exactly the procedures we're going to use, and exactly how it's all going to fit together. But my understanding of the California Environmental Flows Framework is that it does lean on this functional flows concept, and so we're definitely trying to integrate that into our analysis, because it's a really useful tool for looking at large amounts of hydrologic data and trying to understand that stuff.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dan and Adam. We're gonna hear from Brian McFadden. I think most of you know Brian or work with Brian. He's with the Planning and Stewardship Division of the North Coast Regional Board, and he focuses on sediment, temperature, and more recently, flow issues, unavoidable there. He got roped in, impacting streams across the North Coast. And recently, he's been spearheading an effort to coordinate the various flow gauging efforts within the Russian River watershed to kind of better organize them between the multiple organizations that are interested in and doing this work. Are you with us, Brian?
One second. I'm having trouble getting the mute off.
We can hear you now.
There we go. Yeah, a little trick to know. If you hold down the spacebar button, it unmutes you only temporarily. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that introduction. And I do think that spearheading is maybe a little generous. I'm trying to get the conversation started about, or continue the conversation about coordinating our efforts throughout not just the Russian River watershed, but also the other watersheds that I'm involved with flow monitoring, which include the Eel and the Trinity, also mostly South Fork Trinity. But before I go any further, I want to thank Sarah for putting together this this afternoon of really interesting information and bringing us together to once again coordinate. The presentations thus far have been really interesting, and there's a lot of really cool new information that I've found really interesting. My presentation is not one of those presentations. It's certainly not presenting a lot of new information, and it may not be interesting, but I hope you follow along anyway. And what I'm really, I'll just cut to the chase. What I'm really driving towards is a little more collaboration and coordination with all these efforts that we're working on. And I think that we would be well served if we developed a plan that just kind of documented what we're doing and some other things that go into a plan, which I'm going to cover right now. So, but first I want to, just review where streamflow monitoring has happened in the Lower Russian. And, a caveat, I'm not going to be speaking about the Upper Russian and Mendocino County areas, because that's, none of us are really involved with that, or that hasn't been the topic of today. One thing I'd say about the Lower Russian and this group and all the efforts that we've heard about today is, in my experience with all these watersheds that I'm involved in, this is a really interesting or impressive, I would say, network of stream gauges that exist in the Lower Russian, and it's a real resource that doesn't exist in a lot of other areas. The streams that have been monitored primarily have been those where there are coho concerns, and the streams there in the darker blue are where monitoring has happened in the past and is continuing, and the lighter jade-colored creeks there, Grape Redwood and Makama, are where monitoring had been happening but has kind of fallen off. And I anticipate that we may see more of these sites beginning to fall off as resources begin to dwindle, and we've already heard a little bit today about some of those challenges and becoming more challenging. If we look at a map, that network of stream gauges, like I said, it's pretty impressive, and particularly in regards to the efforts of Trout Unlimited. These sites all represent areas where stream flows are being assessed or being measured to address a number of different needs. And this is a map of what I could put together of where that monitoring has happened in the past. Although I have to admit, there are more than this. There's the frost protection gauges that NIMP started and kind of gave up a couple of years ago, and some of those sites continue on as private landowners are continuing to monitor those to comply with frost protection regulations. I thought I had the CDFW water branch gauges in my on my drive, but it turns out that I don't, so they're not represented here, although Todd and Bronwyn presented where their study reaches are earlier. And then there are a number of USGS gauges and some other gauges that that Sonoma Water is also involved in that exist in CDEC that I'm not presenting. Most of those are Russian River mainstem, but also like Copeland Creek and Tributaries of the Laguna also have some gauges on them. But you know, I'm just going to set those aside. I'm sure there are other flow monitoring efforts that that aren't represented here besides those. One of the challenges of grabbing all this data is that there are so many people doing different things, and it's, you know, it's extensive, which is good. Current efforts are a little withdrawn from where they have been in the past, and you know, if we just compare these maps, what you'll see is you know, most of the things that have dropped off have been in Mark West Creek, but also Grape Creek, and so we lose the Grape Creek sites, and we've lost the some of these Mark West Creek sites, like Mark West Creek at Calistoga Road and Alpine Lane, that had been monitored in the past, and so we're already starting to see kind of a shrinking of the network. So the purpose of these stream gauging efforts have really spanned a wide variety of purposes. Of course, we have already been hearing about the fisheries and water quality and hydrology studies that have been underway and are utilizing this data. There's also the model validation that we heard about a bit, that associated with the Sigma efforts and California Water Action Plan that Dan just mentioned. Also, Matt O'Connor's group in the Coast Range Watershed Institute has been developing those Mike-Shee models, and you know, this data is helpful for validating all those models that that rely on, you know, water budgeting information. There's also drought monitoring. You know, has been a need for data, or it has led to a need for data, where I remember back in 2014 and 15, it was clear that these creeks were just dying, and people knew that, but didn't really have a sense of what those hydrographs look like, and a lot of these sites have been put in that helps with that. There's the monitoring to monitor impacts of frost protection that I mentioned. Project effectiveness monitoring to understand how these flow releases are benefiting and impacting salmonids and water quality. And you know, our office has a real interest in understanding and developing the relationships between flow and dissolved oxygen, so that we can understand, or we can inform our own regulatory approaches. So there's really a wide gamut of needs that have been met by these stream gauges. But I would say that despite this really commendable effort by so many different entities, you know, there's some issues that that kind of stand out. One being it's hard to get this data and find it, and we don't have a comprehensive database of flow data, and it's hard to even find who to talk to about availability. In just my efforts to kind of gather up the locations and contacts, you know, it's been real difficult, let alone then also gathering up the flow data itself. Now, methods and protocols are always an issue, and I trust that we're all collecting flow data consistent with USGS protocols, but it's still a question, you know, and it'd be nice to document that, if, you know, assuming that's the case, so that we can verify that we are doing things consistently. You know, the duplication of efforts is something that we've been able to do for a while. but you know, I don't think that that's going to be as tenable in the future as, you know, resources dwindle. You know, the presentation Mariska gave really spoke to that. And so, you know, the question is, are some of these sites close enough together that they could be combined and, you know, be sort of cooperative sites? And, you know, I have real questions about whether the current approach is sustainable. And I'd hate to see, you know, some of these tributaries fall off our monitoring plate. There's certainly a lot of monitoring that happens on a particular tributary that maybe, you know, not all that information is necessary for every need. And so there could be some consolidation and that sort of thing. But it'd be nice to have some confidence moving forward that, you know, we're going to have data for each one of these, you know, really important stream systems. And so I'm here to pitch that we could really use a plan, a monitoring plan for the lower Russian River streamflow monitoring that defines the who, where's, why's, what's, and when's associated with monitoring. You know, defining the priorities and objectives is always a good thing to do, so we know what we're doing or why we're doing what we're doing, especially if we're considering collaborating across different entities. You know, we could make sure that the sites that are monitored satisfy those data needs. A monitoring plan, I think, could also facilitate consolidation of sites and collaboration and site sharing among the different entities that are involved. And I know that there is some interest out there. You know, Corey Gray and I have, and her group have been talking about site sharing and sort of being able to get some synergy from our efforts and our shared interests in Streamflow. And Matt O'Connor has recently expressed some of that same desire to, you know, work collaboratively to expand and extend what we're able to do, or at least you know, maintain what's out there. His interest is interesting also because he's interested in the higher flows that go beyond waveable flow measurements. And so, you know, my program, we're going to try and support that and contribute to that effort. But I think that there's a lot of room for more of that, and particularly with the NGOs who've been doing most of the flow monitoring. A plan could also ensure that we're, you know, using standardized methods, and it'd be good to have a quality assurance plan to document what we're doing and to keep, you know, consistency as people move on and other people come in. Another thing that could help really with standardizing data is if we were to use a consistent field data collection app. You know, we heard from Brian that it was, I forgot his name already, sorry. But anyway, we had heard earlier that that those field data apps are helpful for some of us, and we'd been talking, some of us, about developing a Survey 123 app called, we were calling it FAST, which is Flow and Stream Tracker. And the idea there is that you're always collecting the same data and populating the same fields, and not leaving things to chance in your notebook that you didn't collect something, so that when we eventually do combine these data into a database, that we have the same data. Then it'd be nice to have that database. There's a number of different options for data management, but I think this is really critical because, you know, when we collect these data and have them on our, you know, our servers or on our hard drives, it's easy for those things to just kind of fade out of our awareness. And once we get them into a shared database, they have a life that, you know, kind of continues on indefinitely. There are plenty of options and sort of a spectrum of what that data management could be, you know, from the CDEC website, the California Data Exchange Center website that houses a lot of this kind of data. Joe Kermish-Wells and Corey Gray and others have been talking about developing a database just for our own purposes to track this stuff, and so there's, you know, a effort that started, but maybe that's not the one we want to use. I don't know. Our office, the Regional Water Board, has been working on what we call the R3MP process, the Russian River Regional Monitoring Program, to try and be sort of a hub for monitoring discussions, though that program really has focused on, you know, sort of the data that municipalities collect in regards to their wastewater treatment plants, and also, though, the receiving water data, and, you know, that is most often collected in the Russian River, but also the lagoon and that sort of thing. But this kind of data could easily be incorporated into an effort like that. But I would say, at the bare minimum, if we just had a contact list and you know, sort of a list of the sites that have flow data available and who to contact for it, that would be a big step forward from where we are. And so I'm advocating that we develop a plan that addresses these things and has some sort of facility for sharing data. I was really happy to hear from Mariska that they're working on a data portal. That's certainly needed, but I think we need to think about that expansively. And then another thing to consider is the Senate Bill 19 process, which some of you may not be aware of. This is recent legislation that was adopted by the state legislature in September 2019. And it directs the Department of Water Resources and State Water Board to develop a plan to deploy a network of stream gauges. And that plan would be based on, you know, funding needs, but also opportunities for modernizing and reactivating existing and old gauges, and opportunities for deploying new gauges. It would need to consider information that is necessary for water management and conservation of freshwater species. You know, so we have that in spades here. The water management issue here is you know, pretty expansive. When talking about water supply, flooding, as well as resource needs for aquatic resources. You know, the Lower Russian has seen its share of water conflicts, and that's another consideration that the legislation directs the department and board to consider, is prioritization of stream gauges where not having data has contributed to conflicts in water management. I think, you know, when you look at the Lower Russian, that describes what we have here. Other criteria that the legislation identifies is opportunities for cost sharing with local agencies, ease of integrating gauges into existing networks, and availability of historic gauge data as well as temperature data. There's a bit in there about evaluating cannabis cultivation impacts in the Open Transparent Water Data Act, but also the ability to provide data to assist with groundwater management. And, you know, that's certainly been something that has driven data collection in the Lower Russian. And when you just look at that list, you can see that this describes a lot of what this collective effort can provide. And you know, I would say that having a Streamflow monitoring plan like I'm describing would really be helpful for the board and department in their Senate Bill 19 work. And you know, a plan would be helpful in that it would relate efforts to, you know, how water management affects resource concerns and identify priorities and potential partners, and, you know, be sort of a pre-endorsed list of gauges that that the board and department could look at and say, okay, these people, you know, the locals on the ground have thought this through, and so it's not a high risk to think that what they recommended is well thought out and it's going to be supported. And ultimately, wouldn't it be nice to have some state-funded streamflow monitoring in the lower Russian River tributaries? You know, Department of Water Resources applying their, you know, great expertise to have a subset of these monitoring sites that we've been, as a group, been monitoring throughout the last few years, monitored by the Department of Water Resources, where they have the ability to not only measure low flows, but, you know, get out there with the bridge board and extend these hydrographs beyond just the low flow season. And so I think we really ought to consider what we can do to sort of get ahead of this effort and take advantage of the legislation that Senator Dodd has put together. So there are a number of constraints that, you know, could get in the way of a plan like this. You know, resources are one. Landowner concerns, we're talking about, you know, possibility of multiple people coming to a site. That might not work very well. But also, you know, there's always those concerns that NGOs have about being too closely associated with regulatory agencies. And so I just want to start this discussion. Do others see the value in developing a plan like I'm talking about? Are there other things that would prevent or limit this approach that that I haven't, you know, presented here and that would need to be considered? And if we do think it's worth pursuing, let's talk about a plan on how to proceed. And that's basically the gist of my presentation. And I'm hoping that we can have a little conversation about this. And I'm also hoping that, you know, in particular, you know, those who have had the most monitoring sites can speak up. So.
Thank you. It looks like there's definitely some interest. I know I'm interested. Matt and Corey are saying yes. I'm sure there are other folks here. I think what we should do at this point, it's a little bit after 2, so why don't we close the meeting to people that don't want to stick around for this portion of the program. But also before they go, Brian, if people are interested but can't stick around at this time, should they just email you directly, or will you be kind of sending an email, a broader email out?
So if you're interested in continuing the conversation, please email me. That's really the best way to get a hold of me in this COVID era. And one thing I want to say is the regional board may have resources to help with actual writing of this plan. I can't say that for sure at this point, but it's a possibility that we could do that. We definitely have resources to help with Streamflow monitoring.
All right, this is I think a really valuable conversation. I don't know how much time we have right now, but I would like to say goodbye to everybody that needs to jump off the meeting, and maybe we can just take a few minutes and see like how many people are available to start this discussion and think about maybe we can plan a meeting or what next steps would be, and if everybody's got to go, we can continue the conversation later. Sound all right?
Sounds good.
So thank you everybody for taking the time to come and join us today. I really feel like your interest in and use of this information just really adds so much meaning and value to it. We're really grateful to be partners with all of you other crazy, high-minded, totally committed people that are kind of fighting this fight as part of this collective movement to support flow improvements in our watersheds, because it's really necessary in order to attain species recovery at any point in time here. And obviously to achieve that, it's going to take a commitment by everyone beyond our little village and in our broader watershed community. So thank you for your various and diverse contributions to that. We appreciate your time today. And I'm going to stick around and chat a little bit.
Yeah, I'll stick around too.
So is Dan Worth still on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Dan, I'm curious to hear from the state board on this. I know, it was just what, a couple years ago or so that you all really reduced your gauging effort in the Russian River watershed. Now you're embarking on a new drought planning effort. Do you have plans either within or without of this SB 19 directive to increase gauging, and what might that look like in its, what kind of capacity would there be?
It looks like Dan Schultz got off the call, but Dan's been working on, I think, the SB 19 effort for the State Water Board, and I'm a little bit unplugged from kind of that bigger effort. I will say that we are, I will say that it sounds like a really good idea, and I'm glad Brian brought it up, because this is an issue that we see in a lot of the watersheds where there's a bunch of different groups doing a bunch of different things, and everyone's not always super coordinated, and so I think it's a great idea. And I know from our work and with myself and Valerie and Bob in the Russian River and Marquess Creek, I think that we could contribute some time to trying to help put this together. I don't know if outside of future gauging money that comes from DWR, from the state board, I don't know that we have other money put aside to help fund gauges. But I think we could definitely help with some of the planning and maybe some of the database management, and so I think we could contribute to this effort.
I could be wrong, but one of the things that I understood kind of, led to the reduction of the gauging was just the staff to do the work. If there were opportunities for other folks to maintain, operate gauges, do you think there would be gauges available through the board, or could be made available?
Well, I can address that a little bit. The regional board does have pressure transducers and staff plates that we could contribute. We haven't expended our supplies yet.
Yeah, and I think that we have extra gauges, that are currently sitting on the shelves, especially with COVID. COVID's kind of slowed everything down, slowed all of our field work down, and I'd have to coordinate with some of our other programs in the division who own some of the gauges, and but I think, judging from the past, we would have equipment that we could loan out to people, and if other people were willing to do some of the work, I think that's probably the case.
And would there be a better contact? Would it be Dan Schultz about that?
Probably Valerie Zimmer. I think Valerie could help coordinate.
Yeah, okay. I think so, unless things have changed recently, like one of the things that Mariska touched on, and actually Caitlin from TU, we were hoping she was going to be able to stick around through this point, but it looks like she had to jump off the call. But she was going to talk about like which of the gauges in the Russian River that TU currently operates are nearing their 10-year lifespan. And I know Mariska talked about, applying for some potential funding for that, but it seems like if the boards do have equipment available, there might be an opportunity. I mean, maybe that could be even cost share for funding for their, you know, grant proposal. I mean, they definitely need to be in on this conversation. I think it warrants a broader meeting. Like Brian, you've already been, you've been holding meetings with a number of the partners, haven't you?
Yeah. Yep. You know, we have it's mostly an agency called the Cannabis Flow and Salmon meetings that happen every 3 weeks. And then there's been some spin-off discussions from that as well. You know, one thing I wanted to add related to your question, Sarah, I know that the state board is moving forward with hiring a specialist to work on the plan. And I also want to note that the legislation that was passed only addressed the development of a plan. It didn't authorize funds for actual monitoring. So, you know, of course, the plan is the first step for that, but at this point, you know, no funds have been designated from that effort for this kind of work. So, anticipated, but not authorized.
Seems to be a pattern there.
I believe Dan Schultz, though, is the person to talk to, like Dan works with it, or Val, who works with it.
Yeah, we've been having this conversation. TU, Val, and our group have been having this conversation for a while, and the opportunities that look like they were possible fell through, but I am wondering if the climate's changed with the new drought planning effort and also this SB 19 effort. So sounds like some of this is still unfolding. Do you know the timeline for implementing that directive?
No. Yeah. I just pulled stuff out of the legislation, and I haven't seen a work plan or anything like that.
This is Todd. I'd say, I think it's a few years out. I've been involved a little bit for the department in its consulting role in the SB 19 effort. But yeah, it's still pretty nascent, and yeah, still developing the framework to kind of guide the process and the prioritization process of any stream gauges. So yeah, it's still pretty new here. Yeah.
So on the bright side, we have time.
Yeah, and the time could be well spent to the extent there's energy for it in maybe just trying to identify sort of a core group of gauge sites, really, that you know, we could all kind of see the long-term value of maintaining, and you know, it seems like coalescing around those things would go a long way to sort of this planning effort meaning something and having a target for funding or whatever it is. But that seems like kind of square one to get everybody thinking in the same direction.
And on that note, sort of a question for Marianne and Mariska. Given the current sites, do you anticipate issues with landowner access if agencies are involved, basically?
I'm here. I think it just depends on the landowner. And a lot of our access agreements are running through the RCD. So there's there's just some conversations that probably need to happen. I think some people may not care and some will. I think it just depends.
Yeah. Well, and obviously I think we'd be looking at prioritizing sites that are down near the mouths of these creeks, or, you know, at the downstream end of the interesting reach, let's say, you know, the resource reach.
I think there are opportunities even with the landowner access thing. It's not going to be a shutdown.
Yeah.
In the Russian. I mean, we'll lose some sites maybe, but.
Well, and maybe that's something we can plan around and just not have agency people go to those sites.
Yeah. interestingly, the site that we lost that we were really interested in Lower Green Valley at the 116 crossing, that was a former state board gauge. I don't know, you must have gotten it installed through like regulatory action or something, but the landowners wouldn't give us permission to come out because we wanted to take over operations of that. And they wouldn't allow us permission. I don't know if it was ever really pursued with the landowner, but they had said no to all of our biological monitoring requests. So we didn't bark up that tree. So maybe there's opportunities for some combination.
That cage was operated by National Marine Fisheries, I think.
It was actually a state, I thought so as well, because NOAA, Chad from NOAA, I forget, Chad Edwards from NOAA was the hydrologist responsible for operating it, but it was actually a water board gauge.
Okay, so to move this conversation along a little bit, it sounds like people are interested in continuing this discussion, and I'm seeing that that there's enough interest that we should move forward. And so how about I basically put together a meeting invitation, and to all those who've expressed interest, may also gather in a few other people and nominate you to have interest. But continue this conversation in another venue. Does that sound good to everyone?
Yes.
Sounds great. Thanks for spearheading this, or whatever that is. Maybe that's too generous.
Yeah.
Thank you for your leadership. Moment in time, Brian.
Now that we know that you have to kind of spearhead it, we might just stick you with that one,
Well, and depending on what we're able to contribute from the regional board, this may be a real collaborative effort. And I would suggest that we start with an outline, as a first starting point. What do we want to have in a plan like this, and then see who can take on pieces and parts.
Yeah, that sounds good. And our part, we can certainly, we're not hydrologists. We're not in a position currently to operate gauges. We're trying to step away from that responsibility, but we can talk more about what role we can play in helping to, prioritize gauges based on, the ability to use those data for, effective fish monitoring and the science behind informing what everybody is interested in learning. So we can play a role in that, and also possibly collecting discharge measurements in the field and sending that information to whoever is building the rating curves.
Great.
Here and there, possibly. So yeah.
And regardless
also,
if you're involved with string gauging or not, your program's input would be really valuable.
yeah.
And we're really interested in participating. Mia would probably be the primary person. Caitlin's not on the call anymore, but so some combo of Caitlin and Krisha probably until Mia gets back from maternity leave in December.
In December.
Yeah, and then I can send you the WCB proposal that we submitted that has to do with replacing the gauges that are sort of timing out, plus the portal. And then we have a couple gauges that we're hoping to replace that got burned. So there's some stuff kind of in the works right now.
Okay, yeah, send me that information, and maybe I'll have to look at my data logger inventory, but maybe we can get those ones that were burned replaced sooner than later.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks.
Brian, I don't think anybody would mind if you used even the folks that were on the email list for this meeting. You could all see each other if you use that to send out an email soliciting more interest. If you look in the chat window here, there's definitely interest by more people that aren't here.
Yeah, for sure. Great.
All right, thank you.
Well, I'm glad I asked.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right. Have a
great afternoon.
Thanks for organizing, Sea Grant.
Thank you.
Yeah, our
nice
pleasure.
work.
With the
Thank you very
funding of
much.
WCB.
Thank you,
Thank
WCB.
WCB.
Yeah.